but I can't read, I can't write, I can't spell, and most of the time I don't know my left from my right.
Now here's the thing about me that's a secret that most people don't know. I'm borderline retarded, and I can't read. These books that you're recommending, Goethe, I would pick that up and I would be like, 10 minutes later, I'd be like, what's my favorite song? The ABCs?
I think we're kind of getting off topic. Can you name 10 books?
You're going back to me. Can you?
I just don't want to. No, don't change.
No. You're
10 books.
changing the subject, actually.
10 books.
You're changing the subject,
okay,
actually.
3 books.
Okay. Well, the Game of Thrones series,
not a book.
Twilight
I
series.
want the name
It
of
is
the
a
book.
book. It is a book.
Dress your age. Carrying a school bag on stage. What are you doing with a school bag on stage? You can't even read.
Oh, welcome, everyone. We got a real special one for you today. Welcome to Do You Even Read, the leading show that seeks to spread illiteracy throughout the Western world. We read so you don't have to, and hopefully never will. Prudentialist, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us tonight.
Oh, I'm happy as always to be here, Dimes. You know, I feel like this little show finally fulfills what the great comic and questionable sexuality expert Bo Burnham had once said, that it's YouTube. We're here to prevent a generation from wasting their time reading. And like you said, we read so you don't have to. And as we remarked on previous episodes of the show, all those terrible books that people say that you need to read, all those things where they tell you about the awards for media literacy. Well, we're here to give you that little golden sticker and the blue ribbon that says you have read another book award. We're here to let you know that the only things that are worth reading are the things that get covered on this show. And for once, we are now going back in time to an era where Black Lives Matter was unfortunately way more relevant than it needed to be. And we're covering a book, thankfully, written by a white woman. So, Dimes, how have you been? How was your New Year's? How was your Christmas?
First of all, we're handing out media literacy participation awards every fucking which away. I had a great Christmas. I had a tolerable New Year. And we were talking about this before. It's really funny that, you know, I'm married. I got a young child. And I don't drink. I quit drinking quite a few years ago. And so if you don't drink, I don't know what New Year's Eve is for. I don't know what you're supposed to do. It just seems like a silly thing. So I went to bed early, but I had fun. I had a shrimp ring, a cheese plate. And I think that's, other than the drinking, that's what the night's for. How about you?
Well, I enjoyed a hefty evening of fireworks, a little bit of wine, and then I tuned in early, and because I had to go, I had church for New Year's Day for Feast of St. Basil the Great. So it was a good time nonetheless, and had a great old party at that time. Unfortunately, this season for me is always spread out in like 4 different directions. You and I were talking before the show, because everything's just like, well, one side of the family wants to do this, and then one side of the family wants to do that. So it's really like a whole month of Christmas. And that's fine. Always fun to get in the festive holiday spirit. Then you have to put up with everyone's family drama. And I grew up as an army brat. So it's like, here's all these people that you haven't seen in like 25 years. And it's just like, oh, here we go. Got time to introduce myself every single year. But at least this time I have some interesting books and literature to talk about.
So, oh, look who came down from his cave.
Yeah, right. Except, you know, I haven't seen you in like 20 years. Fuck off.
So Prude, I hear you're an e-celeb.
Oh, no.
Like
the day that
knows.
happens is the day I'm truly doomed.
I'm looking at a lot of people are excited for this book. A lot of people are just excited to be in the chat. It's
I do want to give a shout out though, Dimes, to our friend, our loyal hate viewer, Minoan, who he conducted a poll and said 80% of the people watching tonight are hate watching because of the book that we're reading. And don't worry, guys, we hate read through the book for you, so you don't have to.
Yeah, and this was, you know, we're in the political space that we're in, and so everyone is privy to all of these books. There's a whole library of what you might, I think officially they're called critical race theory books. We might call them anti-white books because that's what they are, but there's a lot of them, and I never read one cover to cover. Everyone's got excerpts, everyone's probably heard reviews, or they have a gist of it, but I never really took the time to actually get into critical race theory and see what they fucking say. And they're always quoting each other too, and that's what's so good about this book, titled White Fragility. The full title, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to talk about racism. In fact, what I'm going to do is just pull that up on screen right now. Let's get this going. Yeah. So here's the cover. White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. Robin DiAngelo, forward by Michael Eric Dyson. Now, I know what a lot of you are doing right now. You're opening up Wikipedia. You're checking the early life section. I'm just going to get ahead of you right now. This is just a full white lady. Pull up her photo. Nothing tricky going on there. She looks like she wears a lot of scarves, a lot of, she looks like a woman who likes to be comfortable and is always complaining about every room being too cold. That's the sort of vibe you're getting from this Robin DiAngelo. And so, perhaps her face and her demeanor might elicit disgust and anger because you kind of hate to look at her. But she wrote, I would say she's one of the leading voices in critical race theory. She's done the tours, and she's one of the few white ladies who I think is accepted in that space, which is dominated by Black guys and Black women. I think that's a fair assessment. What do you think?
I would say that she is what I would call the ambassador class of sort of these like critical race theory, anti-white academics, where she's the one responsible for coining the phrase white fragility back in 2011. And she talks a little bit about it in the book that she wrote about this in 2018. And then she's kind of been relatively quiet, at least in terms of writing. She's been busy in the New Yorker, but most of the things that she does nowadays is anti-bias training, because that's still a multi-billion-dollar consultancy class, work to do. But she is also, if you watched the, heaven forbid, you watched it because you paid for it, and you successfully done and sailed the high seas, and you watched the 2024 documentary, Am I a Racist? She is shown paying $30 in reparations to the documentary's Black producer, but she did charge $15,000 for her appearance. So,
that's so fucking funny. Like, what an arbitrary number. You know what I mean? Like
$30 in reparations. Yeah. Oh, apparently she wrote a sequel in 2021. Nice Racism: How Progressive White People Perpetuate Racial Harm. So I guess she's writing about herself in that case. But I don't think we're going to read that one.
Well, here's the thing, and we'll probably get a few of the main talking points out at the start. But one thing I noticed is that this book isn't terribly long. 160. You can kind of see on the side there. 169 pages. I'd say like 140 of that is the actual book, and then it's fairly repetitive. It's not a very complicated theory. However, what makes this book so rich are all the personal anecdotes she includes, because this is almost an autobiography, I'd say, because she's pulling from her experiences as a DEI racial sensitivity trainer. Just so people know, her job, she went to school, she mastered in this sort of field, and her entire job is getting hired by companies, large corporations, to come in, stand before the staff and just explain to them, if they're mostly white, and they usually are, why that's bad and why they're evil, and why, trying to make them unlearn their implicit bias. So that's how she makes her money. And I guess she's done well enough. One way to view a book like this, when you look at the length of that book, here's a trick for people. If you see a book that's not terribly long, it doesn't seem very complicated, it's probably just a piece of content marketing. This entire thing is just to increase her consulting fees. She releases this in hopes that more people just hire her. So, as you're reading it, keep in mind, this is a desperate woman looking to not keep her career, but almost generate a career.
Yeah, this is the way that you make money, is you go on the book tours, you do the podcast thing. I mean, was it in Bernays, when he was talking about media, he had said something along the lines that the media in his time was maybe like 20% publicity, or maybe even 80%. I don't remember which way of the Pareto distribution he described it. But I mean, in today's world, I would say about like 80% to 90% of most news is publicity. And I mean, books like these are publicity to push an agenda, but also mainly so Robin DiAngelo can keep going on her speaking tours, because the woman that's on the New York Times bestselling list that says white people are bad, well, that's going to keep her job talking about anti-bias training and, white fragility talks going on at the university sector and things like that. So this is the way that she's going to make her money. And I think that you're right, Dimes, that this book, when you read through it, this reads a lot like and I think I said this in one of the group chats that you and I are in. This reads like an auto ethnographic jerk off session where, I mean, like, she's just writing about herself half the time, and then she cites like a black filmmaker or another progressive white person talking about race to just sort of sprinkle it in. But this book is about half autoethnography about herself and her experiences. And I'm going to just say it up front. This book is not only about how Robin DiAngelo hates herself, but this book is incredibly predatory towards open-minded, default Democrat, default normie liberal white women who have that openness, that telescopic philanthropy, that outsider empathy, that appeal to cool black guy fallacy. You want to be seen as cool by them. This is, I mean, really, if anything, Robin DiAngelo is a predator, and she is preying on those sort of normie lib sensibilities of American whites, especially women, that she wants these people to be on board with this program and to, say, white fragility is why you feel uncomfortable when I say these things. But for those of us who are in the know, and I would presume that's chat, that would be you, Dimes, and myself and others in this political space of ours, that really white fragility is boiled down to the vestigial discomfort and awareness of alarm bells that are instinctual when someone says, as a collective group, i.e. white people, you have to roll over and die in order for our political vision to go forward. And if you're uncomfortable about that, that's because you have a fragile ego.
Yeah, and I think it's very illustrative how we covered anti-Oedipus and smile catastrophism prior to this, because it introduced people to a very distinct, I would say, leftist form of thinking, a Marxist form of thinking, about how you're explaining to people a system that they cannot see, and any contradiction to that system only empowers the system. The way she describes whiteness in this, I think, emerges from leftist social critique, because, and we'll get to this shortly, but the way she describes whiteness, it's the entire system. It's almost, you can't break from it. In fact, if you take everything she says and just kind of itemize it, it seems that the only way to ever defeat whiteness is for white people to kill themselves, because there's almost no way to step outside of it. In fact, and let me just preface it by saying this, I am not interested in making this like an anti-white woman thing. That would be very easy to say, like, oh, she said this or that because she's a white woman. And you can be forgiven for thinking that, because I might say some things during this that would give you that impression. Like, for example, just off the top of my head, I might call her a dumb bitch. Now, that's not because I'm anti-white woman. I don't want to just say this is because she's a white woman, especially because, as you had said, this entire book, the intended audience is white women. You only hear Trump or anyone who likes Trump brought up, I think, twice, only in passing. The rest of the book is dedicated with total vitriol towards like lib women and progressive women, not even men especially, but like people like her. And she sees them as the villains because they have made the mistake of thinking that they're better than the racist. Oh, no. They might be the most racist of all, according to Robin DiAngelo. So while, you could be mistaken for thinking I'm just making fun of her because she's a white woman, I'm actually trying to save white women because they're the primary target of this. I think they're the only ones who would read this and maybe be affected by it. Because like we said, so much of it is her sharing her specific experience in a language that I think is pretty female coded. It's very easy to be a guy and kind of laugh at the way she sort of weaves herself around these ideas. But I think she's hoping that white women, and a lot of the examples she gives are white women, they see this and feel guilty and just prostrate themselves before her.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really important thing to look at here. So this is a book written by a white woman for a white woman, or for white women, that is explicitly about a political agenda that wants to erase any agency that white women have in sort of the racial collective that DiAngelo just identifies as white people. And she spends a large chunk of change in this book. And I mean, like Dimes had said, this is a short text. You can read this in one sitting for like maybe an hour or two tops. And you're going to walk away from it saying like, okay, Robin spends a lot of time playing these fun binary games. And the same way that you see a lot of normie cons on Twitter also play this game, which is about whole, individualism versus collectivism. And that, she looks at it, and there's a lot of moments in this book where you're thinking about Covey Theanon's famous little bit there, the woke are more correct than the mainstream. And you'll read it and you're like, wow, this book is kind of like the woke are more correct, because she'll talk about how we do look at things in sort of broad racial generalizations based upon statistics. And we do these things because the way to get out of that is that we use the Mott and Bailey of, oh, I'm an individual and I do X, Y, and Z. And, we can't do it. We can't, not all men, not all black people, not all whites, not all, insert racial category here. But, then she'll go straight up to just attacking you as a group writ large and saying, well, you need to be less fragile when I talk about this in general. You might be a nice person, but overall, aren't we all just a little bit evil?
Yeah. And with that being said, maybe let me just give a quote so people can see what I'm saying here. Now, I don't want to spend too long on this section of it, the foreword by Michael Eric Dyson, but there was one quote that I think helps summarize it here. He says, race is a condition, a disease, a card, a plague, original sin. For much of American history, race has been Black culture's issue, racism a Black person's burden. Or substitute any person of color for Black and you've got the same problem. Whiteness, however, has remained constant. In the equation of race, another metaphor for race beckons. Whiteness is the unchanging variable. Or to shift metaphors, whiteness has been, to pinch Amiri Baraka resonant phase, the changing same, a highly adaptable and fluid force that stays on top no matter where it lands. And see, this is why I wanted to set by saying this is a very Marxist coded sort of thing. It's like this evolving definition. You can never escape it, because even when you attack it, it changes form. Whiteness, like race, may not be true. It's not it's not biologically heritable characteristic that has roots in physiological structures or in genes or chromosomes. But
we would disagree there.
Well, exactly. But it's real in the sense that societies and rights and goods and resources and privileges have been built on its foundation. Whiteness here, in my opinion, takes on the characteristic of the unseeable superstructure. Now, and that's a theme that she mentions this before. So to understand a book like this, you need to understand that, oh, they're doing the thing where they say gender is a social construct, race is a social construct. And they will say very explicitly that it has no bearing on the physical world, which of course is just silly. So to them, racism is something, and we'll get to this in a little bit, but in their view, there is no such thing as race without whiteness. There's only white people who invented this thing called race and racialized the world. So if you hear that term just as you're going about your day, a racialized person, you probably don't even know what that means. What that means is that they're just an individual who, by their proximity to white people, was arbitrarily given a race by white people's existence. So again, throughout this entire book, you get the sense that whiteness isn't an ideology. It's not a religion. It's not science. It's just this fucking essence that automatically secretes from white people. And again, if you take her at her word, it seems to be that she's implying the only solution is the destruction of all white people. Even though not said outright, that's what I interpret. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and it's a historically illiterate take. I mean, for context, there's always been reference to the barbarian, the outsider, both in Indo-European and ancient antiquity, and as well as even during the Christian era. I mean, in modern in Byzantine history, in the height of its empire, and even later in its empire, there was very strict racial immigration policies that would kick out Syrians and other non-imperial citizens and subjects on racial categories alone. So, for this we're looking at this purely from the 20th century sort of Frank Boas clean slate thing, but also in the fact that, racism and race is a social construct developed by colonial Europeans. This is very anti-imperialist Marxist study. And that, really the only way to get rid of it is through the abolition of whiteness. So very Noel Ignatia, very, anti-white coded and very, of course, as you mentioned, very genocidal language.
And what's interesting, and I'm going to make a statement here that a lot of people are probably going to push back on, but you'll see where I'm going with this. There is a way to read this book and believe that she's correct about a lot of things, because within Robin DiAngelo's worldview, whiteness is the center of the world. white people are the main character. There's only people who exist in orbit around whiteness, passive, not even individualistic, but just sort of extensions of nature themselves. She casts whiteness, but European people, but whiteness writ large, as just the only agent of change, almost on a planetary level. So you could say that emerges from her position as a white woman, but it is funny. I even see some people in the chat agreeing, like, "Oh, yeah, we're a planetary race. Of course, we're the main characters." So this was like when you were reading Spinal Catastrophism. If you were to actually, no, it was it was Anti-Oedipus, by them saying that nature and the universe itself is fascist. That sounds very attractive. If you are a fascist, you can be a fascist and like, yeah, awesome. I just disagree that you should do away with the universe. Similarly, you could be a card-carrying white nationalist, read this book and say, yeah, you're right. Everyone exists in our shadow. I like that. Let's keep doing that. So it's if I were black, I'm speculating here, if I was black, I would hate this book. I would not want to read this book. Or maybe I would. I don't know what types of shit they like to read. You know what I mean? But there's a lot that it gives the power to white people and only white people ever.
Yeah, no, I think that's why she probably wrote the second book there, sort of criticizing progressives more so than anything. And I think you have to flesh it out in that respect. But she's looking at this, again, from a metaphysical lens, and not to mention just the one that fits the heuristic of what 20th century anti-imperialism and anti-racist literature is going to tell you.
Yeah, and just to move on here, I'm looking at, if you want me to skip to a page, let me know. This is an interesting, just author's note. There's a lot of preamble to this, but just another thing I think certain people will read and agree with. She says, all progress we have made in the realm of civil rights has been accomplished through identity politics. Women's suffrage, the American with Disabilities Act, Title IX, federal recognition for same-sex marriage. A key issue in the 2016 presidential election was the white working class. These are all manifestations of identity politics. This book is unapologetically rooted in identity politics. I am white and I'm addressing a common white dynamic. I am mainly writing to a white audience. While I use the term us and we, I'm referring to the white collective. This usage may be jarring to a white reader because we are so rarely asked to think about ourselves or fellow whites in racial terms. I mean, I'll leave that up to the audience. Are you ever forced to view yourselves in racial terms in the 21st century? Throughout this book, I argue that racism is deeply complex and nuanced, and given this, we can never consider our learning to be complete or finished. Just that last line I love. We can never consider our learning to be complete or finished. There is no end goal. There is no end point. There's no victory condition to being white. It is a endless, limitless self-critique. It is the latest iteration of the therapeutic state, to psychoanalyze oneself until you're just an inert hunk of matter, just existing. Just imagine just a black woman yelling at you and you're shrinking into a corn cob forever.
And the first thing that she mentions, right, the whole we don't think about ourselves this way, is because you don't really think about yourself when you're the majority. You're the default. You are, I mean, some people had mentioned it earlier that it's main character syndrome, right? Or something like that. Like, of course, this is how it's being addressed. But also it preys on the predatory aspect that I had mentioned earlier. Like, this is for, I'm white, written for whites. And we have to think of ourselves this way because there is, movements of non-white groups in America and other parts of the world that want to, have their power, have it over you. And we need to consider that in the way that the progressive lens wants you to.
We have one comment here from Sean Schaefer directed to me. Grok said you were black. Now, this is breaking news. You're going to hear this first on Do You Even Read? That means I can say it. I'm going to say it. Before the end of this episode, I'm going to say it. What else we got here? Sounds. Robin wants us to bloodlet. Let whiteness ooze out, says Robert Powder. True. Now, we're going to get into her work here. Page 23. So In the early days of my work as what was then termed a diversity trainer, I was taken aback. There's so much of this. So this is such a perfect setup for the rest of the book. I was taken aback at how angry and defensive so many white people were at the suggestion that they're connected to racism in any way. The very idea that they would be required to attend a workshop on racism outraged them. They entered the room angry. They entered the room angry and made that feeling clear to us throughout the day as they slammed their notebooks on the table, refused to participate in exercises, and argued against any and all points. I couldn't understand their resentment or disinterest in learning more about such a complex and social dynamic as racism. Now, I just want to freeze on that. You could just sit back and imagine that. First of all, I love the fake confusion. Like, why don't people want to hear this? Why doesn't fucking Apple want me to show up 200 people, however many is in the room, and have me tell them they're racist? That's weird. Has there been a study on this? You know what I mean? But second of all, the theme of her entire career is her showing up to rooms and people are mad at her. That's her whole fucking life. I don't think there's been a single talk she's ever given where people weren't like spitting at her and slamming their books down or threatening or disagreeing with her. And so, she's created this hell that she's living in where she's the least popular person in the room at any given time.
And this is all in the introduction here, folks.
Yeah. Oh, Sean Schaefer Dimes editing someone saying the N-word. I don't need to do that. I'm black. Grok said, what are you, like an anti-AI person now? So anti-white teacher. I think someone's doing a bit in the chat, and I appreciate this. No white people, whether majority or minority, see themselves as racialists and as the standard human. I'm going to like seeing where this character goes throughout.
Well, I think he's also building off of what I was saying, because I mean, this is how Robin frames the whole thing: is that, well, whites don't ever look at themselves that way, and that whites have never looked at themselves that way, despite the fact that historically we've always made it about ourselves, because we've always even Teddy Roosevelt had made a very, very famous statement about democracies being like the greatest way for like the white race to survive and prosper on Earth.
Well, also, it's as you're going through the book, she'll say that whites aren't used to talking about race. Like, they're confused and bewildered by it. But then she'll say they're extremely sensitive to talking about race, which would imply that they're hearing about it all the time. You know what I mean? So she always tries to hold these incongruent ideas in either of her hand. Whites are all powerful, but incredibly weak. Even the term white fragility, that term, as you'll see through the book, what she's describing with the word white fragility doesn't actually mean fragile. It means an aversion to, like, you don't want to talk about it or you want to be polite. So she's only used the term white fragility as a pejorative. And she used the term white tears a lot. She says, white tears it's not what it sounds like. It's just to refer to, white women who get emotional when you accuse them of being evil racists. Like, you could call it anything else, but you like the idea of making white people, men and women, seem both weak and evil at the same time. So this is like a personal thing for her. And she, at one point later in the book, rallies against emotion, saying emotion is almost always politicized. It's a wild swing she takes later on, but it's like your emotions themselves are manipulative, so you must be emotionless. And if you're a woman and if you get upset by me saying that you're the reason black kids get shot, then that's double your fault. She says shit like that. I'm like, you would only say that if I think you would only say that if you have hate in your heart. You know what I mean? Because she is taking on the weakest people. She is taking on like middle-aged progressives. She's taking on people who are deathly afraid of being seen as racist. She's not going on to shows with anyone we know. She's not going on there with Tucker. She's not going on with anyone. She's like, that would be too hard. She's picking on like 65-year-old women who, and I'm skipping ahead a bit here, but I'm really trying to get this out at the start, that, she will give an example of, a white woman who, like a baby boomer white woman who marched for racial equality, maybe even spent time in prison. And she's saying, you think that makes you special? You think that makes you not racist? You dumb bitch. I'm paraphrasing, but that's like, she's picking on the baby boomer who maybe spent her whole life like trying to get blacks to like her and saying like, no. Black people aren't allowed to like you. they're only allowed to like Robin DiAngelo. It's a strange thing. If she was just out there like being interviewed by Jared Taylor, that would be great. But she won't do that because she's in her soul just kind of a dank bully.
Yeah, this book, Robert Patter in chat. This book is very much a confessional / autoethnography.
All right, we're skipping to page
69 on the. There we go. The just people part, because this is where you're going to get the discussions about sort of where we're getting at here with DiAngelo. So she says, another way that my life has been shaped by being white is that my race has held up the norm for humanity. Whites are just people. Our race is rarely, if ever, named. Think about how often white people mention the race of a person if they are not white. My black friend, the Asian woman. I enjoy young adult literature, but I am taken aback at how consistently the race of characters of color is named and how only these characters' races are named. To use an example from school, consider the writers we are all expected to read. The list usually includes Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck, Charles Dickens, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Mark Twain, Jane Austen, and William Shakespeare. These writers are seen as representing the universal human, if you want to scroll down, the universal human experience, and we all read them precisely because they are presumed to be able to speak for all of us. Now consider the writers we turn to during events promoting diversity, such as Multicultural Authors Week and Black History Month. These usually include Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, Amy Tan, and Sandra Cisneros. We go to these writers for the Black or Asian perspective. Toni Morrison is always seen as a Black writer, not just a writer. But when we are not looking for the Black or Asian perspective, we return to white writers, reinforcing the idea of whites as just human and people of color as particular kinds, in parentheses, racialized, of humans. This also allows white male writers to be seen as not having an agenda or any particular perspective, while racialized and gendered writers do.
Interesting thing here. She will not capitalize the B on Black, but she will capitalize the A on Asian. What did she mean by this? Damn, Don Brown, I love her to hear this. This is the, I don't think anyone else has done coverage of this book like this, like really taking this seriously. Now, what do you think about her assessment here on the writers? This is something you'll hear if you're in academia right now. If you're in university, you're probably hearing this every single day. My claim would be that I'm not sure there are any Black writers of either fiction or nonfiction that don't center their Blackness. Like, I don't think you could ever read a Black fiction book and be surprised that a Black person wrote it. That might be a bit of a stretch, but I think that's true. What do you think?
I would agree. And again, I think that the other thing to consider in this is that the default experience is going to be the default for the majority. And I mean, these things are only happening and particularly being mentioned as demographics change.
Oh, we got a comment from Eskimos56. Guys, you should do an episode where you read Negroes in Negroland, available on Amazon, from 1868. It's maybe one of the funniest, most horrifying books of all time. I'm going to assume that could be fiction or nonfiction. Like, that could be like a Camp of the Saints type thing, or that could be a British guy went to Africa. And both of those books would actually sound pretty much the same. Now, I want to skip back here. We might skip ahead back and forth, but like I said, she repeats herself quite a bit. So she says, I began to see what I think of as the main pillars of whiteness, the unexamined beliefs that prop up our racial responses. I could see the power of belief that only bad people were racist, as well as how individualism allowed white people to exempt themselves from the forces of socialization. And that's just to put it in that's another theme of the book, that white people use individualism, or even just the concept of the individual, as a shield or as a strategy that no one else can utilize. And I don't think I'm being uncharitable here when I say that if you read this book, you would come away with the idea that non-whites are not capable of individualism. And that's one of those things that, like, if you were to read this from a far right perspective, you'd say, oh, I agree. Like, you would agree with that. In a sense, you kind of have to. Like, if I take her at her word, she's saying, oh, after all of my studying, after all my research and countless hours in rooms getting primary research, it turns out that only whites are individualistic. I guess I have to agree. If I were black, I don't know how I would feel about that. But if black people agree with that, well, then it just seems that maybe we're a type of person that just can't get along, right? Because she's talking about like the DNA, like whiteness, of course, has no biological mapping onto reality. Despite this, only people that look white can be white. It seems like it's like a perfect marriage of the metaphysical and the biological, according to her. So you can see people in the chat be like, you know what? She's unironically right. Hey, this might be the next fucking heater for the far right to studying coverage. You can see Mark Collette cover this next week. Let me go on here. I could see how we are taught to think about racism only as discrete acts committed by individual people rather than a complex, interconnected system. And in light of so many white expressions of resentment towards people of color, I realize that we see ourselves as entitled to and deserving of more than people of color deserve. I saw our investment in a system that serves us. And she continues here. None of the white people whose actions I describe in this book would identify as racist, just like we had said. In fact, they would most likely identify as racially progressive and vehemently deny any complicity with racism. Yet all their responses illustrate white fragility and how it holds racism in place. And to me, like I said, this is her trying to square how nobody wants to be in the room with her, because her entire job is yelling at crying women that they're not, who are saying that they're not racist, and her saying that they are. And then I have to believe she's being honest when she acts confused at this and then tries to seek help from her black friends, of which there are very, very few, according to her. And we'll get to that a bit later. But, one of the things she talks about is how she never had black friends up until fairly recently. And she says, we'll get to it later, but she basically says she can't have any black friends outside of her professional setting. She doesn't know how to do it. And she expects that everyone else in the world feels the same way. So it's her, not to psychoanalyze her, but we would call that projecting.
Well, I think also and this was why I think she wrote the sequel, but also the point is that this is why you see so many like fellas on right wing Twitter will say like, oh, well, the woke are more correct than the mainstream on this, is because, the individuality is a pretty uniquely white thing. I would argue to some extent a pretty relatively Anglo thing as well. But no, she mentions that she's racist, Robert, in other parts of the books. Don't worry. But to get to this point here, I mean, it's these unexamined beliefs. Individuals we have the rugged individualism, and this sort of allows us to just sort of have the default. And to some extent, this is America's like frontier culture that Frederick Jackson Turner so famously wrote about at the turn of the 20th century. But I mean, the rugged individual has allowed for us to idealize heroes and to have heroic that are part of sort of this like white Weltanschauung, this like Gestalt subconscious about what it means to be who we are and what that means for us to look around. And when we have to consider others, because we're in a society that, is supposed to be egalitarian, is supposed to provide equal protection, and we have all these laws in the books to do so, that can come at the cost of some things. And that means we have to be willing to criticize that and to do this. And I think that, she takes these sort of basic realities and they get expanded into a lot of academic, just like dribble drabble of language and wording. And again, this is the kind of stuff that your bachelor's holding or your MBA holding white progressive that was like all in on Hillary Clinton and probably voted for Barack Obama twice, which is that she could vote for him a third time, is thinking of and wanting to on this issue. And that's how she's going to go about it.
And I've also got a page pulled up here. I'm skipping ahead to 151, but this is kind of how it ends. It ties back to the beginning. It says, and there's something really important at the end here that I think speaks to her character. But it says, the default of our current system is the reproduction of racial inequality. Our institutions were designed to reproduce racial inequality, and they do so with efficiency. Our schools are particularly effective at this task. To continue reproducing racial inequality, the system only needs white people to be really nice and carry on, smile at people of color, be friendly across race, and go to lunch together on occasion, which is pretty much what she does. Anyway, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be nice. I suppose it's better than being mean, but niceness is not courageousness, is not courageous. And I think that speaks to her drive here, I think, again, not to psychoanalyze her, but I do think behind all this, it's her desire to be a white savior. The criticism of, the white savior complex, the white woman who becomes sort of the democratically elected queen of all of the black subservience to her. She didn't assume that role. They granted it to her, right? That's what she wants. And she wants to be seen as courageous for what she's doing. She wants to be seen courageous by black people exclusively. And by the way, I say black people, you could be mistaken from reading it so far, thinking, oh, this includes Native Americans and Asians and Hispanics. It does not. It is literally only about black people, because in her words, and I think in the words of other black academics, because I'm not even sure how many Asian academics even write books about this. Black academics really run the show on this, but they said whiteness was invented to justify slavery. There was no conceptualization of this thing called whiteness before slavery in America. So if you're starting from that position that, the only people who could ever suffer under racism are black people, no one else is invited to that. This is strictly like a white black, disparity thing with this one woman at the center who has positioned herself to be queen of it all. Just the audaciousness of this fucking cunt. I'm sorry. I'm getting, it's too early in the show for that. But really, she's a loathsome creature, and I'm happy her life is people being mad at her.
The other thing too is that if you go to page 80 on the PDF, I think that when this will just kind of flat out give you the answer as to what DiAngelo means by white fragility. She breaks it down to quite a few PowerPoint or just bullet points here that I think are kind of important to just sort of cover here. So I'm just going to read them out for everyone. Preference for racial segregation and a lack of a sense of loss about segregation. A lack of understanding about what racism is. Seeing ourselves as individuals exempt from the forces of racial socialization. Failure to understand what we bring that we bring our group's history with us, that history matters. Assuming everyone is having or can have our experience, a lack of racial humility or unwillingness to listen, dismissing what we don't understand, lack of authentic interest in the perspectives of people of color, wanting to jump over the hard personal work and get to solutions. Confusing disagreement, not understanding, the need to maintain white solidarity to save face, to look good, guilt that paralyzes or allows inaction, defensive about any suggestion that we are connected to racism, and a focus on intentions over impact. Psychological development was inculcated in a white supremacist culture in which I am the superior group. Telling me to treat everyone the same is not enough to override this socialization, nor is it humanly possible. I was raised in a society that taught me that there was no loss in the absence of people of color, that their absence was a good and desirable thing to be sought and maintained while simultaneously denying that fact. This attitude has shaped every aspect of my self-identity, my interests, investments, what I care about or what I don't care about, what I see or don't see, what I am drawn to or what I am repelled by, what I can take for granted, where I can go, how others respond to me, and what I can ignore. Most of us would not choose to be socialized into racism and white supremacy. Unfortunately, we didn't have that choice. While there's variation in how these messages are conveyed and how much we internalize them, nothing could have exempted us from these messages completely. Now it is our responsibility to grapple with how the socialization manifests itself in our daily lives and how it shapes our responses when it is challenged.
So you can see her sort of going back and forth about how culpable whites are in this. Like here, she says, it's not your fault that you're the cause of every problem in the world. That's why you must address it. She's also saying it's not like any of us would choose to live in white supremacy. Well, why not? Why not? Actually, why not? Why wouldn't anyone choose to be in the supremacist position? And we'll get into what the supremacy actually means. It doesn't even mean having total tyrannical power over everyone. It just means that when you go outside, you feel fucking comfortable, that you're not always questioning yourself, which is what she wants you to do, by the way. Her idea of supremacy is literally just being comfortable in your own skin, in your own community, in your own nation. That is uncalled for, because she also sees she sees whiteness as a global phenomenon. No one is exempt from whiteness because, again, white people are the only ones that exist. This has somehow impacted China. This has impacted Russia, and they're all united, even though blacks are the superstars of this. They're the only ones who can, stand against whites. There's points in this book where a white person will say that, the Native Americans suffered worse than the blacks, and she'll like roll her eyes and say, so what caused you to say that? Is that because you're a stupid white bitch? Basically, she doesn't say that outright, but it's like anytime someone tries to poke holes in what she says with her own logic within her own frame of reference, she'll just turn it back to them like, oh, so I guess white bitch says what? That's what she says every single fucking time. She's not good. According to her, she's very bad at thinking on her feet. And she can always fall back on like, I see you're not trying to deconstruct your identity. That means you're not doing the work. Because, the people will ask, well, what does she want from people? She's very clear on it in the end. And we'll get to that explicitly in a second. But what she says is that in her world, the only way you must surround yourself by black people who are just criticizing you constantly, and you smile and nod and say, yep, I'll work on that. Which is ironic because she had said that smiling and nodding is the most passive and worst thing you can do. Her prescription is to smile and nod and internalize it. And I guess they're supposed to trust that you're doing it. Both of these responses to black criticism are outwardly the same and pretty much inwardly the same as well. Because they're both, she's a white lady, and so everything is just politeness and going, yep, I hear you, I understand you, I will action that, and I wrote as per my email to myself. Like everything is passive aggressive with her.
I think the other thing, though, to really sort of look at it, to get this sort of point of view out of the way, or to at least acknowledge it, right, is that basic in-group preferences and being challenged on in-group preferences, which are already all people have them. Some have them more than others, and there is a multitude of literature that we can all point to that says that whites in America have the lowest tendency for in-group preferences as it is. And I think that has been culturally as well as legally browbeaten out of whites. And also to keep in mind that because things are considered the default, and that whites consider themselves sort of the default humans in this perspective, that we, they'll let it be when the law changes. I mean, whether it be through integration, yes, there was violent resistance to it, but also once the National Guard got legalized, a lot of people just went back at gunpoint and didn't try to do any actual form of insurrection or firing upon federalized troops. And in the same time that's all changed. And yes, people want to live in nice neighborhoods. People want to live in areas where, again, this is why I think that the multiracial whiteness thing out of 2020, and now that we've seen in 2024 with the presidential election results, is particularly interesting. Because when things tend to improve for whites in America, there's going to be these pocketbook issues that people want to vote on. There are parts of Texas and the Rio Grande Valley that have never voted Republican before until Trump in 2020 and 2024 in overwhelming amounts. And that's indicative to talk about issues like immigration, because there's the immigration aspect about, well, we want to be the last ones off the boat and to close kick the plank into the ocean behind us after we get on board and something like that. Those are attitudes that are going to get pressed on here, because in America, the American dream has been the expected default to be white. And she mentions this at the beginning when she talks about like the Italians or the Irish and things like that. Well, we used to be that way. And then she references White Shift by Kaufman. And then she mentions, I think, how like the Italians and Irish became white and so on. And even then, right, like because we've had more immigration, new groups kind of associate with the older that have already been there to do so. And these things don't really get mentioned in this book at all, but it does illustrate that from the progressive side of things, what DiAngelo is hampering on, there are some truths to this text. I don't think we can walk away from it saying like she's a complete idiot or anything like that, but she's also looking at it in a way of, well, how do we accept the fact that these things need to go away, that these things need to change?
I think you had made a point at the start there that this is sort of like the last gasp, like it's an ugly last gasp. This type of person would have in decades past tried to deny things like, let's just say, interracial crime statistics, FBI crime statistics. We all know what they are. We all know the stats. We all know the data. A younger DiAngelo would deny that, but they can no longer deny that. There's a lot of shit libby mythologies that they tried to get away with maybe 20, 30 years ago that they no longer can. They can no longer claim that everyone's the same. They used to say black people and white people are basically the same. No, now they have to rely on, yes, we are we're so different, we can never get along. That's what this book says. White people and black people can never fucking get along. That's the headline. And if I went back to the 90s and say, like, if I told them that this book existed, they'd say, oh, well, so is that published by the National Alliance? Like, who's putting that book out? No. It's a PhD white lady saying that blacks and whites can't fucking live together. Her solution to that problem is that whites should just kill themselves. So we're actually, her and a lot of the Wignats and a lot of the race realists, the Jared Taylors, they actually start from the exact same premise. They just have a different solution to the problem. And I think once you look at her solution, it sounds a lot more extreme than just segregation. I think suicide is a lot uglier than just segregation. And we're trying to play it very safe on this episode for YouTube, but I just think that's a statement of fact everyone can agree with. I'm on page 31 right here. I want to get to more of her anecdotes from her life, right?
Yeah.
Looking at page 31, she says, for example, I recently gave a talk to a group of about 200 employees. Just imagine that. Imagine the size of that room. I'm imagining like an auditorium, right? There are no more than 5 people of color in their organization. And of these 5, only 2 were African-American. Hey, tell me, where can I send my resume? Over and over, I emphasize the importance of white people having racial humility and not exempting ourselves from the unavoidable dynamics of racism. As soon as I was done speaking, a line of white people formed, ostensibly to ask me questions, but more typically to reiterate the same opinions on race they held when they had entered the room. The first in line was a white man who explained that he was Italian American and that Italians were once considered black and discriminated against. So I think that white people experience racism too. That he could be in the overwhelmingly white room of coworkers and exempt himself from an examination of his whiteness because Italians were once discriminated against, and you shouldn't have stopped doing that, by the way, is an all too common example of individualism. Setting aside your sense of uniqueness is a critical skill that will allow you to the big picture of a society in which we live. Individualism will not. You know, it's interesting. I know there's some people in the chat who are denouncing individualism. I actually do think that Western individualism, specifically Anglo individualism, we discussed this when we talked about, who was it, Harold Innis's Communication and Empire and Communication. You know, individualism arises from a literate mind, and it is the illiterate mind, the tribal mind, the oral culture mind that is more subsumed within itself. It's more interconnected. There is no individuality in that sort of tribe, the oral tribe, the savage tribe, one might call it. So while we can say that individualism has led us down a dark and twisted path into social atomization, you know, I don't think you can remove that from the DNA of Westerners or white people. And that is in fact what she's trying to do. She's trying to say, I want you to remove your inwardness. I want you to remove your distinctness. I want you to not only imagine yourself as part of your group, but my definition of your group. See, and that's the interesting thing that she has to do. It's a little sleight of hand. Like, I need you, person who hates being racist, to think of yourself as just a white person, and then stop. Then I'm going to shepherd you over here into my definition of whiteness. But if you stop her from doing that, you're like, white man, think of yourself as a white man, and just get her to shut up. Now you've just jailbroken the lib mind from not even individualism, but just broken them into sort of a racial solidarity. So it's whether or not she's effective at doing that. And I don't think she is. I think there's a case to be made that if you put her in front of more people, you might leave with more racists. What do you think about that?
I think, I think that when you're talking about, say, the individualist, I think the Ennis claim that you make is accurate, just because of how we've talked about that. I think that there is this emphasis on stories, and I think a lot of it does have to do with America's history of the frontier, especially because what emerges out of the frontier are these stories that are heavily based on just like sort of heroic, rugged individualism. And I mentioned Frederick Jackson Turner earlier, but I mean, like, you read what Frederick Jackson Turner is saying, and it's just like, you will lose your Germanic attitude, or the germ of the Teutonic. You'll put on the Indian moccasin and you'll like brave the frontier. And if you can endure with your family or yourself, you become like an individual American. You know, there's this root in there in sort of the American colonial expansionist history that has that individualism. But at the same time, even then, in America's history of expansion, there was always still an undertone of a broad collective identity. It hasn't been until after 1965, especially in the midst of the Civil Rights Act, where that sort of greater public consciousness of a sort of like a white racial collective is sort of browbeaten down for the sake of things like, equal rights, Civil Rights Act, the due process and the 14th Amendment aspect of the Constitution being used to legislate every form of civil rights cases imaginable. So it's not like DiAngelo is wrong in saying like there is a greater collective substrata in the white consciousness that is there. But in this instance, I think that it's also important to look at the fact that, for everyone else, there's the celebration parallax. One side can openly relish and enjoy this and talk about what they're, happy to be a part of. But then at the same time, that kind of, dare I say, pride cannot be, multilaterally and universally experienced through all groups.
I don't know. Do we want to argue with the chat? Is that something we want to do?
I don't.
Let me just say, just to Jake, DiAngelo is the closest thing to an anti-racist. No, she wants to be queen of the black people. If you can't tell that, well, then maybe you deserve her. So we're going to skip ahead here. There's a lot of people taking exception to our discussion of individualism, but maybe we save that for another time. We're looking at page 33 here, and we're going to get more deep into the theory itself. The idea of race as a biological construct makes it easy to believe that many of the divisions we see in society are natural, but race, like gender, is socially constructed. The differences we see with our eyes, differences such as hair texture and eye color, she is, of course, referring to nappy hair and dark as midnight irises. The differences are superficial and emerge as adaptations to geography. Then you would say, well, Robin, why do they persist across different geographies? Then she'd say, well, because of intermarrying. Well, it sounds like there's a biological relationship there. And then she would just say, well, you're probably just saying that because you're white. Moving on, under the skin, there's no true biological race. Don't know about that because we have ancestry tests, but whatever. The external characteristics that we use to define race are unreliable indicators of genetic variation between any two people. She's almost making the case that, you really can't tell the difference between a black person and a white person like side by side. If you squint, if you're Chinese, you can't even tell the difference. As Ta-Nehisi Coates states, and this is interesting. I like it when she quotes other black intellectuals on this topic because you can kind of get a good sampling of where she's getting these ideas from. And so many of them simply make no sense. It says, but race is the child of racism, not the father. He means that we first exploited peoples for the resources, not according to how they looked. Exploitation came first, then the ideology of unequal races to justify the exploitation followed. And this is one of those great moments in the book that you wonder, oh, is there a footnote here? Because there's quite a few footnotes in this. There's a lot of citations, works cited. And you'll notice that some of the biggest claims she has, there's no real work cited for that by saying that, it's completely random that the slaves were black. It could have been white people. We just didn't know. We couldn't even tell the difference. It just, by happenstance, turned out to be black people instead of Asians, instead of Hispanic. There was literally no other reason why West African, sub-Saharan slaves would be chosen on anything other than, just happenstance, right? Here's another quote. Similarly, historian Ibram Kendi, in his National Book Award-winning work Stamped from the Beginning, explains the beneficiaries of slavery, segregation, and mass incarceration have produced racist ideas of black people being best suited or deserving of the confines of slavery, segregation, or the jail cell. Consumers of these racist ideas have been led to believe that there's something wrong with black people, not the policies that have enslaved, oppressed, and confined so many black people. One thing you notice about black people is that they see no difference between slavery, segregation, and being in prison. They think those are actually all the same thing. Segregation, of course, simply meaning that you're not allowed to be, you're not owed the proximity of white people. That to them is a jail cell. Only being forced to hang around black people might as well be prison to them, according to the best and brightest of the black community. Let me see here. Kendi goes on to argue that if we truly believe that all humans are equal, then disparity in condition can only be the result of systematic discrimination. And there it is, and this is what they believe, where they're confronted with the problem. Why is there such a disparity in Black behavior, Black outcomes, test scores, whatever? They need to believe that it's just random white racism. They will not entertain any other explanation. And throughout the book, she talks about that. Like Black people are owed. She'll once say that Black people are owed white schools, but it's also unfair that Black people were made to go to white schools. So there is no solution to this problem that she will even permit. But just to circle back to what they were saying there, it's that, whiteness is the cause of all these problems. And if white people just blinked out of existence, then Black people could succeed because no other explanation is tolerated within this paradigm. And that's just to say, this is how much they despise you, listener, I assume.
Well, I think the other thing to also look at in what you've sort of outlined here is that you can't touch on, even if you subconsciously or you allude to it with respect to, say, human biodiversity. That's a whole other can of worms that she kind of does. She kicks the can down the road, so to speak, while also acknowledging it. It's not just like blank slatism, although I think that blank slatism and Frank Boas has been an absolute disaster for anthropology and the understanding of things. But also, like, it only works in the context of her looking at America and America specifically. Throughout the history of the world in non-European civilizations, as well as in European, there has always been a distinct differentiation between insider and outsider. There has been racialized forms of slavery, not just in the United States, but also in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. There have been parts of this in Asia and other places as well. But for the focus of this, of course, primarily to a white audience, this is what we have to look at. And it's framed specifically for that intention. And now, of course, the challenges that are going to be reading that, that anyone who's looking at here is what do you mean there are racial dynamics I can't see? Well, there's dynamics that we have that are predicated upon, like, the world that you live in, or, for instance, sort of the laws of the land. There are going to be dynamics that you can't see because you still have some, I guess you could argue, advantages, but most of those are also being kept in place are also trying to be eroded away. And I think that those are sort of the things to look out here. And also, if we wanted to get uncomfortable with it, the argument would be to make to DiAngelo, or really to any of them, is that in this struggle and in this long cause of freedom, we have deliberately noticed, not even deliberately, I mean, like, we can all observably notice that things have gotten worse for these communities and for these groups. And I don't mean this in the Paul Ryan, like, well, we have failed to win the war on poverty because we spent $1 trillion and nothing worked. Like, yeah, nothing worked. But also at the same time, the greatest form of cultural genocide that had taken place there is that you can argue would be the Great Society and the Civil Rights Act towards the Black community. Because what did happen? Well, policies that were meant to encourage things such as integration and moving in there for fair housing and whatnot had given people not only an ordeal of civility, to reference John Murray Cudahy, but also the simple fact that we had led to the destruction and the outlining and the blocking of groups into forms of slavery and into forms of life and subsistence existence through handouts that the Black middle class today barely exists as a shadow of what it once was 60 years ago. And if you don't think that that's criminal, then I don't know what to tell you other than our proposed anti-racist solutions only made things worse.
Did you catch that debate between Jared Taylor and Rich Hanania?
No, I did not, because I refuse to acknowledge Richard Hanania's existence.
He really does look like a desiccated corpse. Having said that, it was very interesting because Jared Taylor makes very much the same arguments in an extremely erudite way. But yeah, we kind of talked about this in the great secret, I say, first episode of Do You Even Read, which is the book What Went Wrong, the breakdown of the Black and Jewish alliance. Once again, written by a Jewish person, so you're allowed to talk about it. But it kind of tracks the shift of, like you said, the Black middle class and its current state until certain forces got involved and really corrupted it from the outside. But yeah, that's just to say, I totally agree with your point there. Someone said Stover, Hanania is Laura Loomer's son. I never made that connection before, but I completely believe it. Now, I'm looking at page 37 here. There's a very interesting idea. Once again, an idea that she kind of stumbles upon but doesn't develop, and that's a theme that one of the interesting things she does in the book, she always brings up these facts, these cold realities, but doesn't look into them. So I'll give one here. It says, if we look white, we are treated as white in society at large. For example, people of Southern European heritage, such as Spanish or Portuguese, or from the former Soviet Union, especially if they are new immigrants or raised by immigrants, are likely to have a stronger sense of ethnic identity than with someone of the same ethnicity whose ancestors have been here for generations. True. Yet, although their internal identity may be different, if they pass as white, they'll still have white experience externally. If they look white, the default assumption will be they are white and they will be responded to as white. And there's something she kind of gets into the book later on, which is, and she mentions it, and if she were a true race theorist, like most of my friends on Twitter are, she would try and dive into this. Like, for example, she'll say, well, she'll point to the fact that in other societies, maybe societies that had no interaction with Europeans or white people all throughout time, they understood that lighter skin or paler skin denoted some kind of higher status. In fact, some of the nations, you think of the Brahmins, you think in Asian cultures, this is prevalent, especially in China, if you're lighter skin. And it's not like they particularly like British people. Even people who hate, like the Indians, in Indian culture, they don't like Anglos, really. However, they still have this internal dynamic that's been fed from antiquity that lighter skin is special. Even in fucking Africa, if you're lighter skinned, if you have the misfortune of being an albino, you might as well be a 4-leaf clover that they want to eat. So, you know what I mean? So like there is this essence across the world and across time that pale skin, lighter skin is special, and that exists locked within their historical context. And if you were an honest critical race theorist, you might want to look into why that is. But they don't give a shit about that because that conflicts with their belief that white skin, the importance of white skin was invented by white people just to exploit the entire world. But if you were to actually take the first principles of this and treat it as a real anthropological study, you probably end up at Hyperborea. You end up at a lot of where a lot of people on our side end up. But it's just an idea that she just kind of places there and hopes you forget about.
I think the other thing to also sort of look at in this respect is going to be just the clash of, the ways in which different groups view the world, right? And I mean, for a country like the United States, which is, I feel sometimes it behooves to remind the audience as well as ourselves when people talk about, right now, the big talking stuff on Twitter is about Britain, and with good reason, but also that like Britain per capita is much whiter than the United States is per capita. And so, even then, historically, America's like politics, its defaults, its laws, its traditions, its music, its popular culture, its mediums have been, historically white, and probably still will be for several decades to come, just because that has been the default superstructure that is laid down in the foundation of this country from its first Immigration Act to the people who moved here, et cetera, et cetera. And so these worldviews do clash, and we see it all the time. But we've sort of made it acceptable in the state of not wanting to be seen as racist, because that has been very, and still is to this day, something that can and will get you canceled, and something that can and will have certain groups that have like, arrows pointing down their profile picture, like they're part of Antifa trying to hound you down and ruin your life. Now, I'm glad that we read the book, in part because I think it's important to understand how these people think. But secondly, that, yeah, these clash of worldviews exist. They're always going to exist because people historically don't ever get along the closer and closer they live to one another. To reference Marshall McLuhan, when they were talking about a lot of the political stuff in the 1970s with respects to Quebec, there was this great interview he had done, I think it was like 1979, where they were like, well, Dr. McLuhan, you had talked about this global village. And he's like, well, what did you think that meant? The more we are aware of each other, the more we don't like each other. And that's going to be the case here. It's just that, well, if we offer ourselves these teachable moments and we can somehow get along, then we can make this a possibility for a multicultural coexistence to get well and to manage and to do well together. we know that that doesn't really work in terms of a great kumbaya, because there's limited resources. People want what they want for themselves. And as we know through every election, especially in places like New York City, like San Francisco and Dallas and the rest, that it's about what can you give for me? Those patronage systems try to go on. And for the people that they view as sort of the bourgeoisie, these sort of enriched, wealthy, landed gentry classes, that means you have to play nice with us in a way where you're more docile and more open to these quote unquote teachable moments. Otherwise, things will be bad for you in the future. And when she references people in this book, like she references James Baldwin, and I'm trying to remember what specific text that she is referencing. She references the Fire Next Time, which is basically James Baldwin saying, like, listen, you know, like, we need to find a way to get along. Otherwise, like, you guys might end up like Dresden next time. And that's the fire that comes. And I mean, clearly that's a threat. And that's sort of the language that we have to deal with here. So, like, confront and get along with this system, even though you hate going to these anti-diversity things, or the velvet, you know, glove with the iron gun or the knife will come for you next.
I just want to point to a comment here. Whiteness does not equal white skin. Yes, not acutely, but it's actually on the periphery of the phenomena that we're discussing. That when you, for example, when you say the global South, what do you imagine? It's dark-skinned people. It's shorthand for dark-skinned people. And white people, I think generally, and this is something Robin DiAngelo would probably agree with, and other people will be that, you know, Asians have proximal whiteness. Yes, they're not white, but if compared to a black person or a very dark-skinned Aztec type, they would probably see the lighter skin as something more that they could deal with. And when black people remark on that, well, that is actually true. They're not just schizophrenic. They're not making stuff up. That is true. So there is some kind of spectrum of whiteness that doesn't make you technically that. However, we do sort rank based on there's more of an essence there, right? And to the people said that, oh, darker skin meant you worked in the field. Yes, but it's if you take a person with darker skin who's born with darker skin and never let them out in the sun, I got shocking news for you motherfuckers. They still have darker skin. What the darker skin indicates is that this person is from a caste that across generations are field workers. It's not just a fucking tan. Get it straight. So within these cultures, someone who has lighter skin isn't just someone who's never stepped outside or never stepped in the fucking field. It means that they have light skin because their entire bloodline is set apart. Now, it might be that they were once conquerors. Maybe it's that they had spent 7 generations not standing outside and then they adapted to it. However, it means you're special. So white skin equals special, even within historical, cultural context that had no direct interaction with Europeans. So if you are a student of what is this phenomena, this global phenomena called whiteness, that would be an area of study, saying that, sure, it is a global phenomenon, but you actually can't necessarily blame that on white people, because that is what she's trying to do. That the only reason, she outright says this, that the only reason that people find white European features attractive is because of white propaganda. Whereas I would say maybe they're just more attractive. And maybe everyone on earth is in agreement on that. Maybe 0 people on earth think someone like Lizzo, even if she were skinny, is attractive. And you need to reckon with that. It's not because of white fucking brainwashing. It's not because of NATO. It's not because of something that happened in the 1930s or whatever fucking horseshit she's dredging up. It's actually, that makes race more real. It's not just a trick or a spell that we cast on the world. So,
well, and this is why I think the spectrum thing is particularly important, because I think that both DiAngelo as well as you, Dimes, could agree to the fact that race is real, but also that there is a spectrum and based on enculturation. I mean, like, you'll see this all the time in certain, like, because if you live in the United States, that you know that there are certain like middle class blacks and upper middle class blacks that get called all the time as acting white, because they don't, you know, they don't act as if they're part of the perceived stereotypes of a specific culture, or they get attacked because they have interests that are perceived as white. And we see this, of course, when we mentioned earlier too, in both in chat, but also on this discussion, the sort of multiracial whiteness thing is that there is sort of this shift to want to go with the side that seems to be the one that has a say at the table or wants to be part of the coalition that's winning. And right now in America, as I think DiAngelo to what's his name, Moore, the film director from Bowling from Columbine, Michael Moore, he talked about it too after why Trump won is because like white Rust Belt people and the quote unquote working class, they finally exerted some political forces, because there were also, not to mention, a lot of overlaps between white voters on economic issues, about 15 to 20%, who were Bernie Sanders supporters in the 2016 election, who voted for Trump in 2016 after he lost the Democratic primary. Like, there are these things that indicate that, like, yes, there is racial category, but then there is also sort of like these standards of enculturation that come down on it. And we saw this also throughout sort of the BLM, like, high era of Black Lives Matter, where, like, I think it was like the National Smithsonian Institute had a whole thing on like what is white culture. And there were things that you and I, Dimes, would agree with, like just we like individual results. We expect to be on time. There's sort of that Protestant work ethic in America. They come from certain locations. They're punctual, da 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 da. And these are things that we would say, like, yeah, that's pretty much what it means to be white, right? In terms of expectations in society for culture. And like race doesn't get mentioned, but like these are sort of, I guess, what you would call like, expressions of that culture. Things that are racialized, because America has had a history of a very explicit racial identity up until about the end of the 70s, and things really begin to change in terms of our discussion over who's who.
Exactly. Like, so much of this is still locked within a North American, but really American context. And
well, I mean, this book is explicitly for an American audience. Like, you can, I mean, and the problem is that because this is for an American audience, these kinds of texts will then get exported into other countries, and nations, European and otherwise, that do not share America's history on these issues at all whatsoever, will try their best to adopt it. And a really good area where you see that is in France. Another area in which you see that is in South Africa. And those kind of things are beginning to be purported by certain political movements in those countries, respectively. And I think that the way that you look at that is that you're witnessing, it's very specific niche case. I can't even call it a niche case because it's America. Our greatest export is our cultural battles. And those go everywhere. And that's how it's going to be. And that has some very unfortunate consequences for the domestic politics of other nations.
Actually, I have a part here I wanted to get your opinion on. I don't have the page number in front of me, so I'm just going to read it.
Sure. I'll tell you where it is. I'll look it up.
All right. It says, when a racial group's collective prejudice is backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control. Page 38. Oh, so it's right after this.
Yeah.
Ha ha. All right. When a racial group's collective prejudice is backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control, it is transformed into racism. Sure, a lot of people have heard that before. A far-reaching system that functions independently from the intentions or self-images of individual actors. Now here's a name. J. Kalaluni Kanahuni Gesundheit, professor of American Studies and Anthropology at Wesleyan University.
She's Hawaiian.
That sounds like a fake name for a place. Racism is a structure, not an event. While women could be prejudiced and discriminate against men in individual interactions, women as a group could not deny men their civil rights. But men as a group could and did deny women their civil rights. Men could do so because they controlled all the institutions. Therefore, the only way women could gain suffrage was for men to grant it to them. Women could not grant suffrage to themselves. To this day, one of the worst mistakes. Like, why did we do that? You never get a thank you. People of color may also hold prejudice and discriminate, but they lack the social and institutional power. Their prejudice and discrimination and racism, the impact of their prejudice on whites is temporary and contextual. It is now, I looked at that and think, okay, so you've heard that before. Racism is privilege plus power. Mm-hmm. That was an old line. I don't know if people even say that anymore, but they still believe it, that it's impossible for black people to be racist against white people. But if this were true, if that is how we're defining racism, it would be true then in the racism ended with Barack Obama. It would be true if we're just judging based on institutional power that when there was a black president of the United States, and especially within black cities that had black police commissioners and black mayors, as it typically does in black majority areas, they tend to have institutional power in those areas. That would mean that racism ended with Barack Obama. And if it didn't, well, then I guess that's not what it fucking is it? Right? You control the highest position in fucking America, and in your collective areas, you also control power. So what happened there? You see what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't take much to really kick the legs out from this entire theory. What do you think about that?
Well, the argument that they would give you is that, well, clearly it hasn't done enough. This is the same sort of like constant. I mean, this is a point that even like Charlie Kirk is touched based on, which would be that you have to be in a constant state of perpetual revolution and coalition building. Otherwise, the interscene fights of your coalition fall apart, because it isn't that simple. And they'll just say that there's more work to be done. I mean, this is why one of my favorite bits that I've seen Sam Hyde live talk about is that he thinks that like blacks are like just like time cops, and they're stopping the most dangerous threat to humankind existence, which is like little old Asian ladies on the subway. Watch people walk out from that joke, by the way. It's really funny.
That's such a good joke. That's such a good bit.
Yeah, like they're like time rangers, and it's just like here, stop Earth's greatest threat, little old Asian people on the bus.
Yeah, part of the story of the Terminator is how crazy they look to everybody else, right?
But I mean but the argument that they would make is that, like, well, Barack Obama being in the seat of power for 8 years, we still didn't radically transform the country. And I mean, like, the question that you have to ask at that point is well, when is that enough? When are we fundamentally transformed? Is it when, like the emerging Democratic majority finally happens, and that's the case, or what? Like when the white lashes finally mean that no Republican gets in office, X, Y, Z. And the answers will vary. And I think for DiAngelo, it's just that, listen, you have this little racist bug inside of you that you need to squash with your boot. Otherwise, these people will do it for you. And that to me, it's a really big underhanded aspect of this, because later on in the text, towards the end, she talks about her time, giving presentations to, a speaker, and he's like, oh, well, I have to be careful about saying anything, and people are so oversensitive because I said the word girl, and they're thinking about
oh, I love that one.
But again, like, there are multiple almost like miniaturized case studies throughout this entire book where it just talks about how, like, we're basically just picking on old white boomers, but at the same time, like, these skills, these insensitivities are not enough, and all these things have to go away. And can they be done? Can people play polite and play nice? Absolutely. Even DiAngelo states that it's like, yeah, there are plenty of like quote unquote self-avowed white nationalists that talk to black people all the time, and they get along just fine. They have polite discussions, but that doesn't mean that our views are any more abhorrent and they must be destroyed. In the same way that, like, we have to be careful when people complain about how he had said, like, oh, I had 2 black students, and she said to one of them with girl, and he's like, did you just call me girl? And the teacher was like, I call all of her students.
I assume girl. She was like a Southern belle,
potentially,
type, like,
in the same way that, like, I say, like, sure thing, hun, all the time. It doesn't matter to who or what woman or whoever. It's just part of how it is down here.
Prude has done this to me, like, sometimes when he's trying to explain something, he turns into like a black grandmother, like, ooh, I'm just like, ooh, child.
I'm like, oh, honey, like, you just need to shut up and read. But but I mean, jokes aside, like, these things you see happen all the time, For her, it just illustrates, oh, well, like, these are the dynamics of power, and she never considered the student's reaction and how you might be hurtful. And a lot of this is basic HR, sort of the longhouse aspect of it. But it's like, we have to consider the fact that our social conditions of whiteness, when we are interacting with quote unquote others or the other, you might have to accept the fact that your way of doing things is not always the way to go about it. And for most of us, we kind of understand what that looks like. It just means that there's certain people that you don't want to talk to, or there's certain jokes or certain ways that you don't act around the office. But at the same time, like, for her, like, the conclusion of this is at scale. And it's just sort of like to flatten and level down sort of the like white cultural distinctions of expression within white people.
I got a comment here that I just love because I don't know if this link went out somewhere. We got a lot of colorful characters in the chat. I'm looking at Manuel Georges saying all American institutions are white. Blacks who enter them get assimilated into whiteness. And I'm reminded, and this is going to get us demonetized. I'm going to try not to do this, but there's a famous bit done by Chris Rock. He doesn't do anymore about how he's like, I love black people, but I hate niggas. And he's going like he prefers these black people who are reasonable and nice. And then there's the niggas who are loud and goes into the whole list. You know, Chris Rock tends to belabor the point. But I love a comment like that because it seems to imply that there is no such thing as black people. There is only niggas. Because anytime you enter a white institution, anytime you adopt the characteristics, the outward-facing mannerisms of the dominant institution, you surrender your blackness, which means you're only black if you're outside of the white status quo, which means you need to be basically illiterate and poor all the time. You see what I'm saying? Like if you're not on the furthest fringes of society, you ain't black, which actually is a very liberal way of looking at it. Like they'll see if you're like a fucking Lupe Fiasco type, they're thinking like, oh, here comes Uncle Tom, here comes Lupe, here comes Kendrick Lamar shucking and jiving up the way. I got another great little part here because there's so much we can cover. I want to make sure we get some of the best parts. Hold on. So looking at page 41 here, scholar Marilyn Fry uses the metaphor of the birdcage to describe interlocking forces of oppression. If you, this is great. I love this. I think about this all the time. I love black metaphors. Every time I've heard a black metaphor, it doesn't make any sense. So let's see if you can follow this. If you stand close to a birdcage and press your face against the wires, your perception of the bars will disappear and you'll have an almost unobstructed view of the bird. If you turn your head to examine one wire of the cage closely, you will not be able to see the other wires. If your understanding of the cage is based on this myopic view, you may not understand why the bird doesn't just go around every single wire and fly away. You might even assume that the bird liked or chose to be placed in the cage. But if you step back and took a wider view, you would begin to see that the wires come together into an interlocking pattern, a pattern that works to hold the bird firmly in place. So you have to imagine, like, this might sound clever to a dipshit, but it's like, for this metaphor to make sense, you have to imagine a white person pressing their face against the birdcage. And what does that mean? Because what I think you want to say is that black people are imprisoned within whiteness, but in a sense, white people are the most imprisoned in whiteness, which would mean that we are the bird inside the cage as well. Why would we be on the outside of the cage pressing our faces against the cage? It's utterly incoherent. And it leads me to believe, and I really believe this to be true, that black people don't know what bird cages are or for. What do you think about that?
I'm going to let you just hold on to that one.
Here we go. Robert Platter, Evola might mean a black man who acts European, like the progressives wanted back in the day. Steve Urkel is one example. Oh, sorry. I thought Evola might be a black man. I thought we had a really good comment saying Evola was black, which is another fact I've maintained for quite some time. Here we go. Mark Trouble, here to fluff the chat and provide support for the brown side of the debate. There's wonderful things happening in our chat right now. By the way,
I'm very curious as to who decided to share this with a bunch of lefties. We welcome you, by the way, but I'm just curious who sent you here.
Yeah, let me know who sent you. Maybe it's someone I know. It'd be funny if it was just like third positionist guys. Like, no, I'm a Chinese Nazi. That's why I'm here. Just disagree with you. Okay. Okay. Now, if we go to page 42 here, just going into the theory a bit more, whiteness as a position of status. Critical race scholar Cheryl Harris, now that's a white name if I ever heard one, coined the phrase whiteness as property, tracing the evolving concept of whiteness across legal history. She explains, quote, by according whiteness an actual legal status, an aspect of identity was converted into an external object of property, moving whiteness from privileged identity to vested interest. I mean, just to stop you there, then blacks arguably had the first legal status. which means they might exist more than white people. But, whatever. The law's construction of whiteness defined and affirmed critical aspects of identity: who is white, of privilege, who benefits to accrue that status, and property, what legal entitlements arise from that status. These resources include self-worth, visibility, positive expectations, psychological freedom from the tether of race, freedom of movement, sense of belonging, and sense of entitlement to all of the above. So really think about that for a second.
The history of enfranchisement.
Yeah, basically saying that your belief that you deserve self-worth, freedom of movement, a sense of belonging, psychological freedom is a creation of whiteness. You don't deserve any of these things. And the fact that you feel them at all is wrong. And I guess that's the other thing interesting about this book. Nowhere in it do you detect that she's trying to uplift blackness. She is trying to racialize white people and say, I need you to feel worse. You have self-worth and you shouldn't. You believe you have freedom of access within your nation that you can trace your region even. Forget the nation in the abstract. Forget America. Let's say it's fucking South Carolina. Let's say it's Louisiana. Maybe been there for 12 generations. If you have crafted a world where you can move freely in there, that's a fucking problem. And the only solution is for you to feel worse all the time.
I think that we should also take a look at page 110.
Here we go.
So there you go. Thus, white fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress in the habitus becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. A little bit of Nick Land in there, where exit is like the oldest sort of form of conflict resolution. The Cracker Factory comes to mind. These behaviors, in turn, reinstate white racial equilibrium. Racial stress results from an interruption to the racially familiar. People like their comfort zones. These interruptions can take a variety of forms and come in the range of sources, including, suggesting that a white person's viewpoints comes from a racialized frame of reference, challenger to objectivity. People of color talking directly about their own racial perspectives, challenges to white taboos on talking openly about race. Why can't they talk openly about race? People of color choosing not to protect white people's feelings about race, challenge to white racial expectations and the need for or entitlement to racial comfort. People don't like being threatened. People of color being unwilling to tell their stories or answer questions about their racial experiences, challenges to the expectation that people of color will serve us. A fellow white disagreeing with our racial beliefs, challenge to white solidarity. Receiving feedback that our behavior had a racist impact, challenge to white racial innocence. Suggesting that a group membership is significant, challenge to individualism. An acknowledgement that access is unequal between racial groups, challenge to meritocracy. Being presented with a person of color in a position of leadership, challenge to white authority. Being presented with information about other racial groups through, for example, movies in which people of color drive the action but are not in stereotypical roles, or multicultural education, challenge to white centrality. Suggesting that white people do not represent or speak for all humanity, challenge to universalism. Well, that last one I'm totally fine with. Challenge to universalism is good.
Well, that's interesting because
I'm not a universalism fan.
I wonder if she's even able to approach topics like that. Like, she uses words like universalism and individualism. That will sound familiar to people in our circles. And there's many minds who have dissected these ideas and gone into the multitudinous history of them on both of our shows. I'm sure we've done that. But, I wonder if she just uses these words as a pastiche. Like, does she really understand what universalism or individualism is, in the same way that even Deleuze or Thomas Moynihan might? Because I get that it sounds kind of goofy when she says it, right? She's saying, well, that's a white thing and you shouldn't do. But no, what do you think? Do you understand universalism the same way that Marshall McLuhan might? And once again, you'll see no footnotes here. Like, you're going many pages without any citations. So, like, at no point in any of the citations is there any more robust investigation into individualism or universalism. So, anyway, let me see, just check the chat here. She's slow. Jazo Stein, she's slowly arriving in an industrial society and its consequences from the gay race communism approach. True that. I'm going to skip ahead. We are getting close to 2 hours now, so I want to make sure we get to all these parts here. I'm going to skip this. Here, page 48. Okay, so she goes here. One of the most potent ways white supremacy is You'll love this. I wonder how much I should say, or maybe I should just let the chat fill in the blanks on this one. But I'm just going to read this, and you guys autocomplete this. One of the most potent ways white supremacy is disseminated is through media representations, which have a profound impact on how we see the world. Those who write and direct films are our cultural narrators. The stories they tell shape our worldviews. Given that the majority of white people live in racial isolation, for people of color, and very few authentic cross-racial relationships, consider one statistic from the preceding list. Of the top 100 top grossing films worldwide in 2016, 95 are directed by white Americans, 99 of them by men. You know what? I'm sure that list to some people would appear like these are all white individuals, but she is saying something true. Those who control the media, those who write the screenplays, those who have a hand in controlling the studios probably promulgate a very distinct racial worldview to the rest of us, and we're held captive by it. I agree with Robin DiAngelo, and that's all I'm going to say about that. What do you think about that, Prudentialist?
Obviously, the media is going to be a greatest exporter of culture. I mentioned that earlier. Hollywood, TV, Netflix, etc. It's going to tell you the standards of what culture is and where culture is going.
I'm waiting to see in the chat if the people how autistic some of the listeners are here. We're not going to go into it. Let's just
we're going to carry on.
Yeah. Here's an interesting part. I'm just going to go to page 50 because maybe we can get into ourselves a little bit here in our story. So reflect on representations, racial representations. Ask yourself, did your parents tell you that race didn't matter and that everyone was equal? She's saying this to white individuals, white women. Did they have many friends of color? If people of color did not live in your neighborhood, why didn't they? Where did they live? What images, sounds, smells do you associate with other neighborhoods? What kind of activities did you think went on there? Were you encouraged to visit these neighborhoods, or were you discouraged from visiting these neighborhoods? Now, she said this as if to imply, like her, you were never exposed to non-whites growing up, and so you lived this little cloistered existence. And as I was reading it, I started taking stock in my own life, and I would say I had a lot of racial exposure as a child. I was not brought up in a racialized way. I wasn't really given any instruction on race whatsoever, but I went to public school and I had a whole lot of different friends. And I do remember having a couple of Indian friends growing up. And I do remember going over to their house one day when I was, Christ, how old had I been? Like 10? Elementary school. Little boy Dimes going to an Indian apartment and saying, wow, what's that smell? Not knowing, I wasn't inflicted with any sort of propaganda. I just knows, wow, this is not like my house. There's trash everywhere and it smells pungent. And this isn't what my house smells like or any of my other friends. And I didn't make the connection, but I had black friends growing up. I remember going at a very young age to like a public pool, and it was in a black neighborhood, and it was just like stuffed with black bodies. And I remember thinking, I don't want to go in there. And again, not propagandizing in any sort of way, but this is all to say that I'm not who Robin DiAngelo describes. I'm a young white boy who had so much exposure to other races, and I still came out the other side thinking, well, this is different. I don't like this. I can't explain why. As a kid, you don't conceptualize things that way, but you understand it's different. And she makes a comment later on in the book, and maybe I'll get to it, but she says this, like, again, uncited, unsourced comment. It's one of the wildest things I ever saw in the book. She says that white children claim that they become, they become cognizant of race at around age 5. But she says white people or black people have always known, which means like as a baby, as a newborn, they're aware of race before white people. You're talking about kids that are just starting to form memories, which is such like an insane thing to say. And it wouldn't surprise me if Black people said that. If she went in with, honesty and acceptance, saying like, tell me when you became aware that you were Black. It's like, I was born knowing I was Black. And she just nods and goes, I believe you. Just imagine like just unquestioned, because that's her thing. You have to just believe everything Black. Like, any Black crackhead who shows up and calls you a Yakubian, you have to smile and nod and go, yes, that makes sense. I agree. You know what I'm saying? But I was wondering, like, what if you want to get into this? Like, what were you the type of person she describes? Were you just this person who was raised in like a far-flung balcony away from all forms of race awareness?
No, I mean, I didn't grow up, I don't think, in any sort of ivory tower. Although I'm the kind of person that DiAngelo would say that I still have my inherent biases and my own exposures to what I have as an expectation as a white person for the world, despite growing up as an American, as a white American minority in parts of in all sorts of parts of the country and in all sorts of parts of the world and overseas. I lived in a little town in Germany growing up as a kid, and we had a lot of Turkish neighbors, to which my German neighbors were not always happy with. To me, not knowing the dynamics between the two. I mean, I wasn't completely unaware of race. I also had, growing up as a kid, I had friends of all different backgrounds, because in the military, like, you really don't have time to really be, as a kid, like some kind of like racial separatist, because your parents all were working under the same banner and the same flag. And sort of the message that they really ingrained to you as a military brat was like, listen, yeah, some of you are of different racial backgrounds, but like, you're all Americans and you all represent your parents, your mothers and fathers who are in uniform. And if you fuck up in the world and you make a mess out in the world and the host nation that you're in, and that was the phrase that they used, was host nation, that looks bad on your parents and it looks bad on your country. And it was really more emphasis on the national identity, civic identity aspect, more so than racial. Although I definitely saw it all the time. Like some of my earliest exposures of like racism or like bad people to stay away from mainly had to deal with Romani people, or specifically like gypsies and things like that. Nothing can trigger European racism quicker than anything than talking about gypsies. And I think that American racism sometimes pales in comparison to what you see overseas in Europe. But, at the same time, like, I came of age as a teenager. I finished high school and I went to college in El Paso, Texas, in a city that is like 88 or if not more percent Hispanic, mainly of Mexican origin. Like, I understood that I was definitely an outsider there and that I was looked at as such. And I definitely understood that, like, okay, this is the game I have to play. I can read Spanish at a college level. Like, I'm quite happy reading a lot of things in the original language that it comes out in Spanish. But at the same time, like, I can't really speak it all that well to save my life, which is unfortunate. And also, it didn't help that when I moved there, I knew German pretty conversationally, and all that had to get thrown out the window to learn a different language. But I knew that that's how it was. Like, I went from one foreign country to the next, and things aren't going to be the way that they are. It wasn't until I moved after.
Hey, Prude, I hate to break it to you, as some
I know
of
that makes me a
Czech,
racist.
They may have figured this out, but hate to break it to you, there was another young man who grew up in Germany, and I don't think I need to say any more.
If I recall correctly, that would be Austrian, but nice try. That's the whole, who else drank water? That's terrible. The reductio ad Hitler fallacy is very annoying, in the same way that I think DiAngelo does the appeal to cool Black people sort of attempt here. But anyways, it wasn't, it's funny because like the real time where I really felt like any sense of like racial like discomfort in the way that DiAngelo describes it was when Barack Obama was running for office, and the Black kids on the bus had made it very clear that like, this is the way that we're doing it. This is our way to get back at you. Just talking about like white people in quote unquote the system. And I was like, well, that's particularly strange because, like, again, it's that appeal to meritocracy. It's like, well, Barack Obama's barely been a senator, got elected in like 2006. And after that, he only got really famous in 2004. Like, he doesn't seem all that qualified in foreign policy. But like, no, it got reduced down to an us versus them. And for someone who isn't really exposed to that, because you have these sort of civic, meritocratic, egalitarian ideas that you can argue are definitely white, being challenged, like, yeah, it's going to cause discomfort because it's tribal, high in-group preference versus sort of this like civic Rodney King-esque "Can we all get along" thing. And when those two clash, we kind of know which one wins, and it's the more collective brute force effort over the trying to play nice.
Absolutely. You mentioned Obama there, and it reminded me of a comment she made in the book, just referring to Obama, saying that you would think that electing a black man might have addressed racial concerns. However, he was subjected to racial abuse that I've never seen before. And I yelled at the screen, lies. Because some people might not be old enough to remember when, Obama was elected. I'm an old chunk of coal, so I remember. You might not recall, they called George W. Bush a smelly monkey for 8 years. For 8 solid years. The entire time, they just depicted him as like a dumb, turd-throwing chimpanzee in almost every political cartoon I ever saw. And then Obama took office, and the only thing I ever saw was that he was depicted as the Joker, which was cool. They made him look like a cool, evil clown. That was literally it. That was the only thing that happened. And then they said, I don't like this guy's birth certificate, and they were right. Every criticism against Barack Obama was very. If you were white, you were very careful about what you said. Whereas, like, these were people that were openly saying George Bush should be raped to death for, again, 8 full years. That was just normal. Here's another dumb thing this stupid fucking bitch said. I'm going to page 66. I just want to shine some light on some silly claims. So, page 66. I may feel inadequate in light of my age or weight, telling on yourself, but I will belong racially. For example, in 2017, singer Rihanna introduced a makeup line for women of all skin colors. Gratitude from women of color poured in. Many of their tweets included the exclamation, finally. These are tweets I have never needed to send. Black women never had to send that. Rihanna didn't invent makeup for black people, the black skin tone. That's existed since forever. That's just a nonsense thing. That's just like, what the fuck are you talking about? Yeah, black women couldn't wear makeup until like 2017. How are you an academic and you write something like that? That's what you get when you actually just believe black people. They just say, like, finally, they make makeup for me. Like, have you gone to a store? What's a store? Like, they've never walked down a fucking store aisle before. And you're thinking, you know what? That's white people's fault.
Well, the argument that you're going to run into is that, again, the default is white, and that if you're not being represented, this causes harms, and that this causes the way that it is. And this will be the argument. And it's like, well, when you're so used to being on top that, representation or anything that seems like equality, it's going to feel like oppression. And I would argue that that's probably actually true, that when you're used to being the majority and that's being whittled away and so on and so forth, it's going to feel oppressive and it's going to feel bad. The issue is that I don't think that even if you got to some state of magical, like, multicultural, multiracial coexistence equilibrium, as I mentioned earlier with elections and with politicking and racial patronage groups, it's not going to be a kumbaya. I mean, things are very much explicitly written, especially by a lot of Black liberation writers in the 50s and 60s, that these things are predicated on an animus and a motivation of revenge.
Absolutely. You want to get to more of Robin DiAngelo doing it wrong? Here we go. This is the part this is worth it just for the entire book, because so much of it is this. Here we go. Page 67. For example, I was invited to the retirement party of a white friend. The party was a potluck picnic held in a public park. As I walked down the slope towards the picnic shelters, I noticed 2 parties going on side by side. One gathering was primarily composed of white people, and the other appeared to be all black people. I experienced a sense of disequilibrium as I approached and had to choose which party was my friend's. I felt a mild sense of anxiety as I considered that I might have to enter the all-black group. Then mild relief as I realized that my friend was in the other group. This relief was amplified as I thought that I might have mistakenly walked over to the black party. George Zimmerman would not have stopped me as I walked through the gated suburban neighborhood. There's a lot to unpack there, but maybe in another life, maybe if we caught her early, she could have been, talking at an American Renaissance conference, just her describing the sheer panic. Oh, just washing over her. She thought she might need to hang out with black people in a public park. And then her saying, you know what? This is white America's problem.
And you notice real quick how where James Lindsay and others like him might say, DiAngelo's points here sound so similar to the quote unquote woke right.
Yeah, I like that everyone's woke now. James Lindsay really is unifying America, calling everyone a race hustler communist. Not only we're all literally communists according to James Lindsay. Trump really pulled it off. There's some other stuff here.
We're all woke now.
And here's another part where she projects a bit of herself onto everyone else. So scroll down here. For upwardly mobile whites from the lower classes, reaching toward the most valuable places in society usually means leaving friends and neighbors of color behind. For example, I grew up urban and poor and lived in apartment buildings in crowded, rental-based neighborhoods. In my childhood, there were many people of color around me. I just really wanted to soak this next part in. But I knew that if I was to improve my life, I would not stay in these neighborhoods. Upward mobility would take me to whiter places, and it has. I did not maintain those early relationships with people of color, and no one who guided me encouraged me to do so. Just like that could be just if you read one thing from the book, maybe that could be it, which is that here, Robin DiAngelo didn't have black friends growing up. And she thinks that because no one told her that she should, that society is broken. Like you would think she would just even by accident, have one single, maybe she had a black best friend growing up. Maybe she goes back to visit the old neighborhood. She never even went back to fucking visit. She wouldn't even call them acquaintances. Again, like she could be on red ice next week if she wanted to. If she cut all the things where white people should die, most of this would fit pretty neatly within the zeitgeist currently.
Potentially, yeah, sure would for a certain subset of the right.
And here's where we get to the fragility part. I'm jumping ahead to page 83 here. Within this paradigm, to suggest that I am racist is to deliver a deep moral blow, a kind of character assassination. Having received this blow, I must defend my character, and that is where all my energy will go to deflecting the charge rather than reflecting on my behavior. In this way, the good-bad binary makes it nearly impossible to talk to white people about racism, what it is, how it shapes all of us, and the inevitable ways that we're conditioned to participate in it. We cannot discuss these dynamics or see ourselves within them. We cannot stop participating in racism. And this is a theme she returns to a lot in the book, and I don't know really how to square this, where she says, okay, white people believe in this thing called good and bad, and exists as a binary. They believe racism is bad, so they don't want to be racist. So if you call them racist, they will think that they are bad, and then they will fight to defend themselves. However, this entire book is her saying that white people are bad and racist. So she's trying to break you from the good-bad dichotomy while encouraging you to live on the bad section of that dichotomy permanently. So like, again, once she's holding these two incongruent things, that you should stop believing in the good-bad dichotomy, but believe in badness so much that you believe you're always bad forever, because there's no way for you as a white person to break out of the prison of being bad.
And to build off of what we were talking about with the last book that we covered on this series, with respects to anti-Oedipus, the de-individuated person, right? If we were to look at this and in that context, like not only do we have to go further than say the Marxist way, we actually have to break down the structure. Well, what are you left with if the structures of your sort of worldview, of your desire to be producing, to be making, to be building, to exist, what is left of that? And it sort of raises an interesting question as to like, do we want sort of like the white frame of mind to be sort of like, a way of death in terms of like being a body without organs, and then in turn sort of now, floating in sort of this peritoneal, cavity of organs that do exist, that are usually more in-group cultivated ethnic cultures. Things to just, I'm thinking out loud, but I'm just noticing that there's a particular dichotomy where it's like, you have to be mindful of others. And it's like, well, on one hand, I totally get that, because I think every other person on earth, and white people included, know that they have to be mindful and to navigate different cultural mores, because it's been built in our societies as long as I've been alive. And at the same time, I think that it's also particularly interesting that it's never enough. And there's never a question where this book really just tells you that, like, it has to be interrogated and that fragility has to be challenged. And then this is a way for white people to understand themselves, but also she acts kind of as an ambassador to say, well, this is why white people have such a hard time talking about it. And well, to me, it just seems like the reason why they have such a hard time talking about it is because you are challenging the basic assumptions in which they live and expect to live. And apparently that's just an innately wrong and bad in these viewpoints, despite the fact that historically that has always been the case in the United States. And now that isn't the case, or won't be the case for much longer, that, it feels like a very veiled threat, but it's not so veiled.
Absolutely. Before I respond to that, I just want to mention Ozark. He was saying Red Ice is great, learned a lot. They were proven right and stuff. When I mention Red Ice or American Renaissance, I'm not saying they're bad. I'm speaking for myself here. I'm not trying to say anything about Prudentialist's tastes in media, but speaking for myself, I'm not saying either of those are bad. I'm just saying that if you tweak a couple of things, just like with Anti-Oedipus, their founding principles and where they give the agency to the problem could fit nicely there if you just tweak some of her conclusions. So I don't want it to be seen as I'm fucking throwing daggers at them. But yeah, one thing that sprung to mind as you were saying that, Prude, is that, white people, especially in America, have been insanely tolerant of other races. The example I always give is like, I mean, have you ever, for generations, we've been dealing with Chinese food restaurants, and up until like 5 years ago, no Chinese person tried to get good at English. And in a sense, and we're always being corrected if we don't pronounce someone's name properly and go, oh, stupid me, butter tongue. But you're dealing with people who like butcher the English language every single day. And you're like, yep, well, it's hard. I mean, we're always meeting people halfway on everything. And to the point where we're meeting them when they're hostile to us and saying, you know what, I understand it. And that's really what the white people in these instances are doing. Like there's cases in this book of women who are at these workshops saying, you know what, I have some racial biases. I want to fix them. Maybe I am racist. Maybe white people are racist. And that's still not enough for her. And that's the message of this book. And like you said, that's where we're at now, where we have conceded so much and the demands have not lessened at all. And it's become more and more hostile and less reasonable until we arrive here, which is saying that, you know what, maybe you should just fucking kill yourself. And how are you going to negotiate with that? What am I supposed to do when Tim Wise is on CNN, when Robin DiAngelo is doing a tour of, on the media saying that more white people should kill themselves, which would not be tolerated. And the fact that we tolerate that at all is mind-blowing. The fact that this book has a publisher is fucking mind-blowing. And there's white people right now who have libraries full of this stuff and say, yep, you know what? I guess I am the worst. But there is a distinct white behavior set where you read all this stuff and you take it and you're like, yep, but I'm going to change nothing about my life. I think that frustrates people like Robin DiAngelo. Like a white liberal could read this book and say, yeah, you know what? We should do more, and then just go skiing. That's what makes me happy about a book like this, which is she gets to live her entire life watching these shitlibs change not a single thing. They're still going to secretly try and live in a ski lodge as many months out of the year as they can. I don't know if I'm getting you in trouble. Maybe I've gone a bit too extreme.
No, it's not that. It's that it raises a question I've always asked rhetorically, because I've always known kind of the answer to it, or at least it's the vibe I get, is that when you ask and I mean, we saw this too with like the 2024 election, right? Like, what is a heterosexual white male role model for progressives? Your answer was supposed to be Tim Walz. Your answer was supposed to be Harry Sisson. Your answer was supposed to be the Dean Martin guy from the Zoomer TikToker or whatever. They were supposed to be sexy. They were supposed to be sex symbols.
That was so funny.
They were supposed to be, like white people tacos. These very derogatory white racial stereotypes that are the expectation going forward to be the bumbling TV dad. And like, again, that seems like a caricature. And that seems awful. And that seems like an existence that is below anybody's dignity. And again, I kind of find it funny. Like, you get rid of these historical caricatures or stereotypes. So you get rid of Aunt Jemima, for example. Well, Aunt Jemima's gone, but okay. What was she replaced with? Like, what proud black mascot replaced her? There wasn't one. She was just erased. So a cultural aspect of black history removed. Even though, yes, the history of the mammy is long and colored and checkered of history.
It's colored all right.
Well, yeah, poor choice of words. But like it's checkered in the past of like, servant, and then of course with respects to, slavery and whatnot. But again, gone. And what gets replaced? I think something a little more kitschy, something that's a little less authentic. But again, those are my white expectations. But
we've got a comment here that came by twice. I think maybe this is something you might want to just quickly answer because maybe you have an opinion on this. Chris Hassler, Prude and Dimes, who is worse in your view, James Lindsay or William F? I assume he means Buckley and not Buckle, but
well, James isn't a former spook, and there's no such thing as a former spook. So I'm going to just argue Buckley, just because Buckley worked for intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't like James. Like, who's worse, by who can do more damage or did more damage, or who you would like? Maybe the answer is like, who would you like to see frozen in a quick freezer and then taken out and just smashed to smithereens, not in a gory way, but in like a Looney Tunes way. So, like, for me, it's James Lindsay. I don't know if I would like to see, a piano dropped on William F. Buckley, and then I pick him up and he's all flat, and I take him, I spin him around, and I look and find the nearest roof and go woof and just chuck him. Just chuck him right on a roof. Now that's James Lindsay.
Tell us how you really feel.
Well, how can you be mad at that? How is that actionable? How is that demonetizable? I ask you. So I know we're getting up to over 2 hours now, so we can probably start.
Call it there.
I'm trying to see if there's one last thing. See if I can wrap this up here.
I think that one of the things that you should look at is the last section that I would recommend reading would actually be towards the end, and it would be chapter 10, page 126. Just these 1 through 11.
Oh, here we go. Yeah. Here we go. So, by the way, Syllabus says, "Have a good night, Prudentialist, and everyone. He's sick." I tell you what, I'm sick. I'm sick of
I'm sick of racism.
I'm so diseased with racism.
Here it is. Just on outrage. Outrage at the suggestion of racism is followed by righteous indignation about the manner in which the feedback was given. After years of working with my fellow whites, I have discovered, as I am sure have countless people of color, a set of unspoken rules for how to give white people feedback on our inevitable and often unconscious racist assumptions and patterns. I have found that assumptions and patterns. Excuse me, I'm just a statistics appreciator. I have found that the only way to give feedback without triggering white fragility is to not give it at all. Thus, the first rule is cardinal. Do not give me feedback on my racism under any circumstances. If you insist on breaking this cardinal rule, then you must follow the other rules, and there are 10 of them. Number 2, proper tone is crucial. Feedback must be given calmly. If any emotion is displayed, the feedback is invalid and can be dismissed. True, you can't be seen as uppity.
That's the thing. Like, she's making fun of you as she's listing this, by the way. It's like, oh, here's why white people are fragile, because you need to be calm and reasonable. Like, I get sorry. Like, again, is the expectation, my white expectation, is that people speak to me reasonably and don't just hurl insults at me. My bad, my mistake.
Carrying on here. 3, there must be trust between us. You must trust that I am in no way racist, and before you can give me feedback on my racism. 4, our relationship must be issue free. If there are issues between us, you cannot give me my feedback on racism unless these unrelated issues are resolved. Odds are they're not that unrelated. 5, feedback must be given immediately. If you wait too long, the feedback will be discounted because it was not given sooner. Well, yeah, you need to address it quickly. 6, you must give feedback privately, regardless of the incident occurred in front of other people. You give feedback in front of others in any ways to commit a serious social transgression. If you cannot protect me from embarrassment, the feedback is invalid, and you were treated as the transgressor. Well, yeah, I mean, you're going to cause a social. It has to be really egregious. It's got to be. I mean, like, someone's got to be singing "My Old Kentucky Home" for you to be doing it publicly. Number 7, you must be as indirect as possible. Directness is insensitive. I feel like that's not necessarily the case. I think I would prefer if someone's going to like straight up call me a racist, just be direct. But carrying on, as a white person, I must feel completely safe during any discussion of race. Suggesting that I have racist assumptions or pattern will cause me to feel unsafe. So you'll need to rebuild my trust by never giving me any feedback again. And when I say safe, what I really mean is comfortable. Well, those are usually hand in hand. 9, highlighting my racial privilege invalidates the form of oppression that I have experienced: classism, sexism, heterosexism, ageism, transphobia. Remember, the race goes above all things here. For DiAngelo, the racial transgression will go above all the things that are mentioned in parentheses. Number 10, you must acknowledge my intentions, always good, and agree that my good intentions cancel out the impact of my behavior. 11, to suggest that my behavior had a racist impact is to have misunderstood me. You will need to allow me to explain myself until you can acknowledge that it was your misunderstanding. Heaven forbid we have a cross-examination as to why I am acting the way that I did.
Yeah, like the example you gave earlier of, or the one she gave as well, about the white teacher who called a black woman girl, even though she calls everyone girl, and saying you can't do that because you did not take into account the racist history. That's a line she says in this book, and I don't think we've quoted it yet, but it's one of those lines that I bet a lot of people in chat would agree with, which is that each individual carries their racial history with them. And I think she's saying that exclusively to white people, like, you bring the history of whiteness, you manifest it with your very presence. But in that sense, so does everyone, unless, if she can go to the extreme and say there's only one race, the white race, and everyone else. I don't think she's saying that presently. However, it wouldn't surprise me if these critical race theorists will say that eventually. Going to the extreme that whiteness is the only race. There's whiteness versus everybody else. But, there's this idea that, anyway, I'll just be relitigating myself. But she was just saying that, only you could ever be at fault, but you are the only one that could ever change the situation. And there's this other part in the book. And again, this will sound extreme, but I'm asking this within her framework, accepting all of this is true. If it is true that this system is white supremacist and it privileges not explicitly our power, not our financial gain, but just being comfortable and being non-anxious and just being able to go about our lives, why should anyone give that up? She never answers that in the book. I looked very closely all the way to the end. Like, what is the one reason you would give to a white person that they should give up this supposed supremacist position? There's nowhere does she say that the world will be a better place. Nowhere does it say it's just accepted by faith that it's unjust, but you haven't explained that.
Well, it's a better place for those that have been aggrieved.
Yeah, it's like you're comfortable and other people are uncomfortable. I'm like, I don't care. What's in it for me? Being uncomfortable? I don't want to be uncomfortable. If you're telling me how to make black people more comfortable, I mean, that's what these libs are trying to do. But the argument is that white people should be more miserable. Nowhere in this does it say that like why people should want that. And I think for the type of audience that this is going for, they would never even ask that question. They just take it on faith from their worldview, which is based on the news, based on late night talk shows and all that. They just accept that, oh, this is anything that creates division is bad. But no, explain it to me, a white man, not the white woman. This is written for a white man. Why should I make everything shittier for me? Shut up. You gave an example about the only one who could grant suffrage and rights to women was men. Yeah, why do we do that? We didn't need to do that. It stands to reason we could take that away. Tell me why I shouldn't take that away, Robin. write a book on that, because for all the guys, there's only one group of people who has power, according to you. According to you, it's white men. You decided to not write the book towards white men. You decided to write it at the fucking mirror, you dumb bitch. But it convinced me I should give you anything. Fail. Sorry. Turns out I want to take all your rights tomorrow. What now? What now, weird lady? Weird lady. There's this fucking great thing. I know we got to go into, but I really wanted to get to this.
Yeah.
And I didn't have this written down, but I'm just going to paraphrase it. I thought about this a lot. She ends the book by describing an instance where she was racist, right? And maybe we talked about this. I don't think we did. She was meeting with, I believe, the dean of a college, and she had her two helpers with her because, of course, Robin DiAngelo, she's in the lead, but she's got her black sidekicks, of course. And then she's explaining to this client everything about how difficult it was in these room full of white people. And she gestured to one of her aides, her sidekicks, and says, "Oh, I think the white people were just scared of her hair." And just imagine her saying that as if it's a joke, right? A joke she thought she could tell because it was making fun of white people. Then later on, the black woman, her employee, basically confronted her and said, "Well, that was an inappropriate thing you said." And even me, as extreme and radical as I am, I read that and I said, "Jesus Christ, that's a racist." Like if I were in that position, I would be like, "Damn, woman, like you fucking live like this." Like that would, like, if there's one thing I know about this, is like, don't make fun of a black bitch's hair. That's the one thing you don't do. And here, the least racist person in the world did a day one error like that. But it just stands to reason that there's something inside of her that doesn't, it seems like she doesn't really believe any of this. She's making mistakes that a fucking Nazi wouldn't make. You see what I'm saying? And then she's being like talked down to and interrogated by her own people. She's like, "Oh my God, I had no idea. I hadn't considered it." I'm like, you hadn't fucking considered it? This is all you think about. It's fucking wild to live in Robin DiAngelo's head. And then she's explained that. It's like, no, that's a mistake anyone can make. No, it's not. No, it's not. Fucking, Jared Taylor wouldn't make that mistake. He wouldn't know. But I guess he's not the expert on being white, right?
Well, I think that the most telling passage out of all of this, because we were asking, because the question is never, it's never enough, and she says it here at the end. Page 150. "Because I am seen as somewhat more racially aware than other whites, other people of color will often give me a pass. While this is certainly more comfortable for me, it doesn't hold me accountable or support my racial growth. I ask my friends of color to trust that I can handle their feedback, and then it's and that it's on me to demonstrate myself as worthy of that trust. Although I recognize the risk it takes, I would not have my current awareness if people of color had chosen to protect my feelings. Since my learning will never be finished, neither will the need to hold me accountable." Never ends.
I think she really wants more black friends. Like when I read that, it's like the only way I can get better is if more black people hang out with me and tell me what I'm doing wrong. Like that's it. Like your learning's never finished. So you could, like, apparently you can't do it yourself. Apparently Robin DiAngelo, the expert on being anti-white, doesn't fucking know how to do it herself. So she needs to hire, I don't know, literally any hood rat could tell her just that she's saying bad things. Anyway, I know we gotta get going, so we're over 2 hours. I know we got some super chats here. Did you have access to those? Did you want to get to those?
There were a couple. There was one from Robert Weisenfeld, who had said "spectrum of whiteness," and he says, "It's me." Very true, Mr. Weisenfeld. Very true. Maddie I says, "There is a pamphlet called," I'm not even sure if I want to be able to read that. It is called "The Delectable Negro," and it is about the intersection of blackness and cannibalism in media. And apparently this is very real. It's by Vincent Woodward, originally
I was hoping to be a cookbook.
No, it explores the homoeroticism in both literal and figurative acts of human cannibalism that occurred during slavery in the United States. Woodward, apparently he draws on the Works Progress Administration's advertisement for runaway slaves, the treatment of Nat Turner, whose flesh was turned into medicinal grease. Woodward died in 2008 and never saw this book published. However, it did win a Lambda Literary Award for LGBT studies, and that is because he received, it's because he died due to complications from HIV/AIDS. Interesting. Okay, well, there you go. So those are the super chats that I had. So we appreciate it. I don't think I'm going to read that in the same way that the word the lovely F slur has been turned into apparently a discipline of academic study. But
By the way, who was the guy who did that buck breaking documentary?
That would be
What's his name?
Tariq Nasheed.
Tariq Nasheed. When I heard about,
I've seen that, by the way. Hell of a. I want to accuse him of being a closeted case, but it's a very interesting way in which he's simply saying that like homosexuality is a weapon to like weaken black men, and he blames white people for it. But I mean, like, it would be a take that I'm actually not disagreeable to, because like you look at what Hollywood is doing, although Hollywood white people, like you look at what they're doing to like blacks and like dresses and everything like that. It's like, no, like he's right. He's somewhat on target.
Well, no, really what's interesting, Tariq Nasheed, and we covered that on the show too. Not only that, we did a live viewing of it, and that's why that clip is only available on Odyssey. But what's interesting about that is he's taking the phenomena of black men wearing dresses and blaming that on white people, which is to say that one might think that he's saying that, oh, whites raped black people and that was a punishment. No, he's blaming the tendency for blacks to be so gay. He's blaming that on white people. So it begins with the admission that black men, and if you actually look at the numbers, that bears this out, that the majority per capita of trans individuals tend to be black, and gay men tend to be black as well, way more than you would think. And he's saying, oh, the reason that is because we were raped by white slave owners. And so it does come across as a fetish. That's why I was listening to that that the cannibalism one, by saying the intersection of cannibalism and eroticism. I'm like, does every punishment you talk about need to be so horny? Must it be, oh yeah, this is white people ate black people, and the fact that black people are turned on by that is white people's fault? Like, okay, just don't bring me into this. I want nothing to do with horny cannibalism.
Yeah, I don't either.
What is this, the 80s?
Yeah. What is this? All those Italian cannibal Holocaust films? No, thank you.
Who do you think you are, Mr. Rob Zombie? So anyway, we can end it there. I believe we covered all the major points in this, because again, you have to understand me. From what we said, it just repeats it again and again and again and again. And it's more and more stories about people being angry at her and her being like, gosh, I wish that people weren't so mad at me all the time. And then, what I liked about it, like I said, was the references to other black thinkers and her pulling from this area of thought that I don't have experience with. And maybe I'm not sure I'd like to read more, because from what I saw, the metaphors pulled and the excerpts, it all sounds very, very stupid. Like it like as in just not interesting, and also poorly thought out and very poetic. Because black intellectuals think that if they just say something in a soulful, poetic way, we will think that is valuable nonfiction. And I'm not fooled by that. Motherfucker, I read CCRU shit. I got my fill of weird nonsense said in a poetic way,
I think it's still important to listen to this stuff. One, in part, because I think that while oftentimes I can have a pretty good understanding of where the left is coming from on a particular issue, and that the right tends to know the left better than the left knows the right in a lot of ways, outside of just calling us racist chuds or whatever, I think that it's good to know how these things work, in the same way that people will call like the three body problem like mid science fiction. And I'm like, no, that is great science fiction, because you need to understand how the Chinese think. Like that's more of a interrogation of like the Chinese mind and also their foreign policy than anything else. And also because I think like the dark forest theory is really interesting, even though you can poke holes in it, I think.
Yeah. You raise a good point there, a fantastic point. And that's why it's good to end on this, which is that it's important to figure out what they actually mean when they say terms like white fragility, because one could be led to believe that means weakness or cowardice. No, to her, white fragility is the righteous anger expressed by white people when they're accused of being the worst thing in society. That's what she means by fragility. It's not even just, sadness. It's rational denial. If you argue with her, that is fragility.
Yeah, and I think that that's something to sort of consider is that we talked about this when we decided to read Anti-Oedipus on the show, was just that, okay, clearly there is reason to read this stuff because it is cited so often on the left, but it is also cited by people that claim to deconstruct or blame the world's problems on postmodernism. Well, maybe we should read it for ourselves. I mean, that was really the big impetus on starting this whole Do You Even Read series anyways, is that there are books that are considered like canon classic essentials for politics, left wing and right wing, or somewhere beyond or post or whatever. We have to understand, if we want to understand these people, your friends, your enemies, your foes, your allies, whatever, you actually have to read what they mean, because this literature is still at the bedrock foundation of what the last 4 years was in terms of the Biden administration that is soon to come to an end. But it is still everywhere in terms of bureaucracy, HR, boardrooms, etc. It's not going away anytime soon, and it is important to understand what this sort of thing looks like. And as we just saw at the end of this book, there's no real conclusion to it. So the revolution is never ending for these people. And that's an important thing to consider when looking at our politics.
Yeah. And according to the experts, the people who are authorities on this, if you're a white, you are racist, and there's no escaping it. So after you're done reading this book, you might come away with the conclusion that you shouldn't even try, because according to her, it's impossible. Work as hard as you might your entire life. The only way to exit the original sin of whiteness is death. And she doesn't say that outright, but it's very easy to reach that interpretation if you actually take this seriously. And I think, I don't know if the Tariq Nasheeds and the Ibrahim X-Kendis say that outright, but I think she's trying to win at being anti-racism, so she will say, just like Tim Wise is another character who just is very open about his genocidal intent. Anyway, I know we got to get going now. I just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. I had a phenomenal time. I really loved reading this. I really loved discussing it as well. I hope everyone else enjoyed listening to it. And we're going to find out how far and wide this stream went, because we've had some interesting chats come through.
Yeah, certainly. I'm a little curious as to where it went, but nevertheless, we'll be back. We're going to talk about which book we're going to cover next. We've got quite a few options. This was definitely going to be a one-off episode for this text, because again, it's only like 169 pages on PDF. You can read this in a short sitting if you're really interested. I would recommend the bibliography if you want to know more of how DiAngelo came to these conclusions, as well as some of the names that she cites in her acknowledgments for her equity advisors and the rest. So again, this is a whole industry, multi-million-dollar industry, well worth looking into, well worth researching. But the next book we cover will probably be a two-parter, depending on which one we select. But we'll be back before you know it with another episode of Do You Even Read? And thank you for tuning into our fun little episode kicking off